She stood at the altar of his coronation, his chosen Luna, his fated mate, and he looked her in the eyes and tore her soul out in front of 1,000 witnesses. No warning, no mercy, just a king's cold decision and a woman's world collapsing in real time. But here's what Darius Blackthorne never calculated. You can exile a wolf to the frozen north, strip her of her title, her bond, her dignity, and she'll still come back. Just not the way you expected. Stay until the end. You won't sleep after this one. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my pack is watching from tonight. The Great Hall of Blackthorne Keep had never smelled like blood before a coronation. That was the first thing Celine noticed when the procession doors swung open and the heat from 10,000 candles slammed into her face like a fist. The air was thick, roasted pine resin, melting wax, the perfume of noble women who'd spent fortunes to smell like imported flowers. But underneath all of it, threading through everything like a wire drawn too tight, was the copper iron scent of something wounded. She told herself it was the slaughtered elk in the feast hall, the ceremonial kill, tradition stretching back 8 generations of Blackthorne kings. She told herself that because the alternative, that the blood smell was coming from inside her own chest, wasn't something she could afford to believe. Not tonight. Tonight she was Luna. Celine Frostvale kept her chin level and her shoulders back as she moved down the Crimson Runner between 2 walls of the most powerful wolves on the continent. She'd practiced this walk for 3 months. 14 steps from the doors to the first column. Hold the pace. Don't look at the faces. Fix your eyes on the altar where Darius stood in his black coronation armor, and remember that every person in this room needed to believe she was worthy of standing beside him. She focused on his silhouette at the far end of the hall. He was tall. He'd always been tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that made other alphas instinctively calculate the distance between themselves and the nearest exit. The coronation armor was polished obsidian plate trimmed in wolf silver, and the crown hadn't been placed on his head yet, but he wore the weight of it already. You could see it in how he stood, how he breathed, like a man who'd spent his entire life training his body to carry something enormous, and had finally arrived at the moment where the carrying began. Celine had loved that about him once. She was still deciding whether she loved it now. The mate bond between them hummed low and constant in her sternum. A living thread, warm and stubborn, the kind of thing you didn't choose and couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't felt it. Their wolves had recognized each other 2 years ago in the middle of a border skirmish that neither of them had any business surviving. She'd been a Frostvale scout. He'd been a Blackthorne commander with a broken sword and a bleeding side and more cold fury than she'd ever seen compressed into a single human body. She'd dragged him out of that ambush. He'd looked at her afterward with those iron-gray eyes and said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which she'd later learned was the closest Darius Blackthorne ever came to being speechless. That was the bond. That was what she was walking toward now. She made it to the altar without stumbling. Small victories. The High Elder, Old Marin, white-haired and sharp-tongued and ageless as the mountain, stood waiting with the coronation crown in both hands. Behind her, the sacred flame burned in its iron basin, the only light in the room that wasn't candles. It was blue. It was always blue at coronations. Tradition said it was the breath of the first wolves, the ones who'd walked on 4 legs and chosen to stand. Celine took her place beside Darius and kept her eyes on the flame. She didn't look at his face. She'd learned in 2 years that there were times when Darius's face was not something you could look at directly and remain composed. This felt like one of those times. The elder began the ritual words, pact bonds, blood oaths, the weight of the crown, the covenant of protection, the alpha's promise to stand between his people and extinction. Celine had memorized every line of the ceremony. She'd read the transcripts 3 times, flagged the parts where her responses were required, practiced them until they lived in her throat instead of her brain. When Marin placed the crown on Darius's head, the Great Hall released a sound that Celine felt in her molars. 2,000 wolves acknowledging their king, a resonance that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite silence, but lived somewhere in the animal layer below thought. Her own wolf rose toward it like something drowning reaching for light. Alpha energy, deep and territorial and old, flooding the room. Darius didn't flinch. He stood with the crown on his head and looked out at his kingdom, and for exactly 3 seconds his eyes found Celine's, and she saw something in them that she couldn't name. Something that looked like regret, which didn't make sense because regret came after the mistake. Then he looked away. "Before we complete the bonding rite," Darius said, and his voice filled the hall the way it always did. Not loud, not projected, just carrying like a stone dropped in still water. "I have a declaration to make." Celine felt the first cold thread move through her stomach. Around her, she heard the rustle of 2,000 people adjusting their attention. Declarations weren't part of the ceremony. Declarations were something else entirely. She made herself stand still. The role of Luna carries the weight of this empire on its shoulders equally with the Alpha King. Darius hadn't moved. He was still facing the hall, not looking at her. That weight demands more than a fated bond. It demands power, lineage, strategic value to the kingdom's survival. The cold thread became a current. Celine heard herself say his name, just his name, one syllable, barely above a breath. Darius. And she heard the sound of it leave her mouth and understood immediately that it was the wrong instinct, that reaching for him right now was the wrong move, but she couldn't pull it back. He turned then. He looked at her with those iron gray eyes, and she saw it clearly now. Not regret. Resolve. The specific kind of resolve that meant a decision had already been made, was already done, and the only thing left was the machinery of consequence. "Celine Frostvale," he said. Her name in his mouth, formal, stripped of everything that had ever lived between them. "I renounce the mate bond." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. Then the great hall erupted. Not in outrage, in shock first. The specific paralysis of an audience that has just witnessed something its brain refuses to process. And then in the rapid low-grade chaos of 2,000 people turning to each other with wide eyes, whispering, calculating, their wolves spiking with secondhand aggression and confusion. Celine didn't move. She was aware of several things simultaneously: the heat of the ceremonial flame on the left side of her face, the specific texture of the stone floor through the thin soles of her ceremonial boots, the mate bond in her chest, still there, still warm, still humming its stubborn animal certainty. Because you couldn't renounce a mate bond with words. Words were human things. The bond was something older. She was also aware of Cassia Voss. She hadn't noticed the woman before, which she realized later was intentional. Cassia Voss was standing 12 feet to Darius's right, positioned at the edge of the altar space where visiting dignitaries stood during ceremony. She was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in the deep burgundy of the Voss Empire's house colors. Old money. Old blood. One of the Eastern continent's most powerful alpha lineages, a family that controlled 3 trade routes and 2 mountain passes that Blackthorn had been trying to negotiate access to for years. Cassia Voss looked at Celine with the careful, measured expression of a woman who had been briefed extensively on this moment and had practiced not showing satisfaction. She wasn't entirely successful. "Furthermore," Darius said, and his voice had not changed, not by a fraction, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted, "I announce my formal intent to bond with Cassia Voss of the Eastern Territories, cementing our alliance and securing the Empire's eastern borders." Someone in the crowd made a sound. Not words, just a sharp exhale. The involuntary vocalization of witnessing something that crosses a line most people consider permanent. Celine found Darius's eyes. She held them. She didn't cry. She wanted to note that clearly, even if there was no one to note it to. There were no tears. There was nothing in her face that she couldn't control. She'd spent the last 2 years learning to exist inside the orbit of a man who treated vulnerability like a strategic liability, and whatever that education had cost her, it had given her this: the ability to stand in front of 2,000 witnesses while her world disintegrated and show them nothing she hadn't chosen to show. "You should have told me," she said. She said it quietly enough that most of the hall couldn't hear it. She said it to him, only to him, the way you'd say something to a person in a burning room when you both already know the building is coming down. "This isn't personal," Darius said, just as quietly. The cold that moved through her then wasn't the thread from before. It was something else. Something that started at the base of her spine and climbed, and she recognized it, distantly, the way you recognize a natural disaster by its early signs, as the first stage of a rage so absolute it had no temperature at all. "You're standing in front of everyone I have ever known," she said, And you're ending what we are, and you're telling me it isn't personal." His jaw tightened, just barely, the only crack in the marble. "The kingdom needs—" "Don't." The word came out harder than she intended. "Don't explain the kingdom to me like I'm a courtier who wandered in from the wrong party. I know what the kingdom needs. I've spent 2 years learning what the kingdom needs. I gave you counsel when your war council gave you nothing. I stood on that northern border in the dead of winter with 40 scouts because your intelligence was wrong and someone needed to be there. Don't tell me about the kingdom." Darius said nothing. "Look at me," she said. "Look at me and say it again." He did. That was what broke something in her chest. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that he looked at her with those iron gray eyes and didn't flinch and said, with all the terrible weight of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at an answer he could live with, "You're not what the Empire needs. I'm sorry." Elder Marin made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, and Celine heard it clearly, which meant the hall had gone quiet enough to hear breathing. "The Luna bond will be formally dissolved at the new moon," Darius continued, raising his voice back to hall volume, returning to the ceremony he'd interrupted, treating what had just occurred as a necessary procedural step that had now been completed. "Celine Frostvale will be escorted from Blackthorn territory within the next 12 hours. Given her services to the Crown, she will be granted safe passage to the Northern Territories." Safe passage to the Northern Territories. There were several ways to say a thing, and that particular grouping of words was one of the cleaner ones. What it meant, stripped of the diplomatic language, was exile. The Northern Territories, the frozen stretch of land above the Empire's last formal border, was where Blackthorn sent people it couldn't execute outright, but needed to disappear. It was where broken wolves went, rogues, exiles, the ones the Empire had decided were no longer worth the maintenance cost. She was being packed off to the place where wolves went to die of cold and irrelevance. In the silence that followed, Celine became aware of a specific subcategory of sound, the sound of 2,000 people deciding, in real time, where this moment placed them. She could hear it, the subtle recalibration, the drawing back, the careful, neutral expressions replacing the earlier shock as people understood that the power in this room had just been sorted, hard and fast, and that anyone seen expressing sympathy for the discarded Luna was making a political statement they might not be able to afford. She saw Lord Carver, Darius's oldest war council member, a man who'd patted her on the shoulder 3 weeks ago and said she'd be a fine Luna, look deliberately away. She saw the Voss woman step forward to take the position at Darius's side. She saw the elder's face, and the elder's face was the one that nearly undid her. Old Marin, who had no political calculations left in her, who looked at Celine with something raw and helpless and sorry, and Celine looked away from it fast because that face was a door she couldn't open right now. She turned and walked out of the great hall, 14 steps from the altar to the first column. She counted them. She didn't look at anyone. The crowd parted, not with respect, not anymore, just with the instinct of people moving away from something falling. And she walked through them like she was walking through fog, her ceremonial dress trailing on the stone, her spine straight, her face empty of everything except the specific blank composure of a person who has decided to perform function until function is all that's left. She made it to the doors. She made it through the doors. She made it approximately 40 feet down the corridor beyond, to a window alcove behind a heavy tapestry, before her legs stopped cooperating. She didn't fall. She hit the wall instead, both palms flat against the cold stone, and stood there breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd been taught for battle. Because this was a battle, she told herself. It was just a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapon was humiliation and the wound was designed to be slow. The mate bond pulsed in her chest. It was still there, still warm, still stubbornly alive the way bonds were, the way it would remain for days yet. It took time to unravel, even when one side was trying, because the bond wasn't interested in what either of them wanted. It was just there, old and animal and indifferent to political strategy. She hated it right now. She hated the warmth of it. She hated that some part of her wolf was still reaching toward him through the wall between them. Lady Frostvale. She didn't turn around immediately. She recognized the voice, Petra, her personal attendant, 17 years old, and relentlessly loyal in the way that young people were, before they learned how loyalty got used against you. Don't! My lady, they've already sent guards to— I said don't. Celine pushed off the wall. She turned around. Petra was standing at the edge of the tapestry, wide-eyed, her braid coming loose, her hands pressed together in front of her chest in a gesture that meant she was trying not to shake. Celine looked at her and felt something move in her chest that was separate from the bond. Older, simpler, just human. The girl had followed her from Frostvale territory 18 months ago. She had no family in the southern lands. She'd come because Celine asked her to. Go back to Frostvale, Celine said, tonight. Don't wait for morning. I'm not leaving you at Petra. She kept her voice level. She made it a fact, not an argument. What's happening tonight is the kind of thing that sticks to everyone in the vicinity. You go back north. You tell them what you saw. You tell my mother— She stopped. She breathed. Tell my mother that I'm fine. Petra's lower lip was doing something complicated. Is that true? Celine looked at her for a moment. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet. The damage assessment hadn't been completed. She was still in the part of the injury where the body hadn't fully registered what had happened, running on shock and adrenaline and the animal competence that took over when the thinking mind became a liability. Tell her I'm standing, Celine said. That seemed to be close enough. Petra's chin steadied. She nodded once, quick and fierce, and then stepped forward and grabbed Celine's hand and held it so tightly the knuckles went white, and then let go and walked away fast without looking back. Smart girl. The corridor was empty again. Celine stood there in the cold stone alcove and did an inventory of what she had. The dress on her back, ceremonial silk, completely useless in any practical context, worth approximately nothing outside a great hall. The silver bracelet on her left wrist, Frostvale made, an heirloom that her mother had pressed into her palm the morning she left for Blackthorn territory. The boots, which were thin and decorative and not designed for anything resembling survival. The training in her body, 4 years of scout work, 2 years of running logistics and intelligence for a war council, the specific accumulated knowledge of someone who had spent her adult life learning how things broke and how to keep functioning when they did. And the bond, still warm and useless in her chest. She had 12 hours before the escort arrived. She started moving. The servants' corridors of Blackthorn Keep were not a mystery to her. She'd spent 6 months learning them, not because she'd anticipated needing an exit route, but because understanding the infrastructure of a place told you more about its actual power structure than any map of its official rooms. She moved through them now with the specific, unhurried pace of someone who belonged wherever they were, which was the first rule of moving through enemy territory. Uncertainty was visible. Certainty wasn't. The kitchens were still running at full chaos, the coronation feast being the largest logistical operation the keep undertook all year, and she moved through the edge of them without anyone looking twice. She got bread and dried meat and a skin of water, tucking them into the folds of her dress without ceremony. She found a storage room off the east passage and located the winter gear she'd clocked weeks ago during a supply inventory she'd run for the War Council. Heavy wool cloaks, fur-lined, military surplus, nothing ceremonial about them. She took one and a pair of boots, 3 sizes too large for her feet, and stuffed the extra space with strips of wool she cut from the hem of her silk dress with a kitchen knife she'd also taken. She was doing this methodically, step by step. She was not thinking about the Great Hall. She was not thinking about the look on Darius's face, that resolved, terrible look, or the sound of 2,000 people making their calculations, or the Voss woman stepping into her place at the altar. She was not thinking about any of it, because those thoughts were the kind that got into your joints and made you slow, and slow was how you died. She was thinking about the Northern Territories. She'd been told it was where broken things went. She'd been sent there to disappear. Fine. She'd go north. She just wouldn't go broken. The East Servants' Gate opened onto a delivery yard that connected to the outer road. She knew from the courier schedules that there'd be a supply wagon leaving for the northern waypost at the 3rd hour, late enough after the ceremony that the guards on the main gate would be rotating shifts, early enough that the celebration inside the keep would have reached the stage where everyone who mattered was drunk on their own ambition and not watching the exits. She was in the yard before the 3rd bell. The wagon master was a compact, weathered woman named Bessa, who had been running supply routes between Blackthorn Keep and the outer territories for 11 years, and who had, On one occasion, helped Celine run intelligence packets to border scouts without routing them through the War Council's official channels. Not out of loyalty to Celine particularly, just out of the pragmatic disregard for authority that long-haul freight workers tended to develop as a survival mechanism. When Celine climbed up beside her on the wagon bench, Bessa looked at her. Looked at the oversized military cloak and the stuffed boots and the bread visible through the folds of silk still showing at the hem. "Heard something happened at the ceremony," Bessa said. "You'll hear a lot more by morning." "You heading north?" "Yes." Bessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Waypost 12 hours out. I can take you as far as the border marker. After that, you're past what I can cover." "I know." Another silence. The horses shifted against their traces. Inside the keep, somewhere muffled by distance and stone, something that sounded like celebration music had started up. Low strings, drums, the sounds of a court beginning to assemble itself around its new king and his strategic alliance. "You're not planning to disappear, are you?" Bessa said. It wasn't entirely a question. Celine looked at the dark road north and didn't answer. "Right," Bessa said, and clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled. The 12 hours passed the way brutal things passed. Not slowly, which was what people expected, but in strange intervals. Some moments crawling and others swallowing whole stretches of time. Celine slept for 3 hours against the wagon's side wall, which she hadn't expected to be able to do, and woke to find the sky the specific iron gray of pre-dawn and the landscape outside fundamentally different from what it had been when they'd left. The Blackthorn territories were wooded and relatively temperate. Old-growth forest, managed hunting lands, the cultivated rolling farmland that fed the Empire's southern belly. She'd grown up in the transitional zone, Frostvale territory sitting at the edge of where the managed land gave way to something older and less interested in human management. But the northern road through the Empire's last formal territories was different, older. The trees were different species, right? Harder, lower, spreading in ways that spoke to wind and cold rather than light and growth. The road itself changed texture, better maintained in some stretches where waypost traffic made it necessary, crumbling at the edges where maintenance had given up. At the border marker, a stone post 12 feet high, carved with 3 generations of territorial boundaries, the most recent one marking Blackthorn's current northern edge, Bessa stopped the wagon. "End of what I can do," she said. Celine climbed down. She adjusted the cloak. The cold hit her differently out here, away from the wagon's body heat, sharper, more intentional, the kind of cold that was not an absence of warmth but a presence in its own right. She looked at the marker. Then she looked at the road beyond it, which continued north into territory that the Empire's maps labeled with increasing vagueness. Waypost names first, then geographic markers, then finally just the word northern, and a line that suggested the Empire had stopped caring about specificity at that point. "Celine," she turned. Bessa was still on the wagon bench, holding the reins, looking at her with the expression of someone who had calculated whether they had something worth saying and decided they did. "I hauled freight for the Marin territory before the Blackthorn consolidation," Bessa said, "before Darius's father swallowed them. Had a regular route through the upper north. Before—" She paused. "Things were different up there, is all. People have long memories up there, longer than the Empire likes." Celine held her gaze. "There's a village called Ashford," Bessa said. 4 days north at a walking pace. 2 if you're moving with intent. Old rogue settlement, been there longer than the Empire. They don't send exiles back. They don't send anyone back. Ask for a woman named Rook. Tell her Bessa says the winter owes you a debt." She paused. "I don't know what that means." "She will." "Thank you," Celine said. Bessa nodded once. Then she turned the wagon around and headed south without looking back. Celine faced the road north. The bond was still there. Dimmer now. Distance had that effect. Stretched the connection, made it thinner. She could feel it the way you felt a conversation happening in another room. Present, audible in outline, stripped of detail. She stood at the border marker and let herself have 60 seconds. This was something she'd learned in scouting. The psychological cost of suppression was higher than the cost of acknowledgement. So she gave herself 60 seconds to feel the full weight of it. The humiliation. The specific devastation of being unmade in public by someone you had chosen to trust. The grief of the bond itself, which her wolf didn't understand as betrayal yet, only as distance, only as wrongness, only as a wound the animal couldn't locate. She felt it, all of it. She let it be as large as it actually was, which was enormous, large enough to knock down lesser architecture, large enough to explain why wolves who lost their bonds this way sometimes didn't survive it. At 60 seconds, she stopped. She picked up the pack she'd assembled from Bessa's wagon. Small, practical, nothing she hadn't needed before. And she started walking north. 4 days to Ashford. She had food for 2 if she was careful, a cloak that would hold through 2 nights of cold if she was lucky, and 11 years of knowing how to move through territory that didn't want her there. She also had, and she acknowledged this with the specific clarity of someone doing a damage assessment, a rage that had no temperature at all, the kind that didn't burn but froze, the kind that was patient, the kind that lasted. By the second day, the cold was serious, not survivable with difficulty serious, serious, the kind where the air in your lungs felt like swallowing glass and the ground had a particular quality underfoot that meant frozen solid below a deceptive surface layer of give. She'd grown up adjacent to this kind of cold, but not in it. And the difference was everything. She kept moving because stopping was a choice she couldn't afford. On the second night, she found a ruin, old waypost structure, collapsed on one end, but offering enough of a windbreak on the other to be usable. She built the smallest fire she could manage that still produced meaningful heat, ate the last of the bread, and sat with her back against cold stone and her wolf pressing up against the inside of her skin with an insistence that had been growing for 2 days. The wolf wanted out, not to run, though that was part of it. Her wolf wanted to shift because the bond's damage was easier to metabolize in 4-legged form, where the body could outrun the wound for a while, where the grief translated into speed and territory rather than the particular human torture of stillness and thought. She let her shift for an hour, let the white wolf out into the dark and the cold and the stark northern landscape, and watched through shared eyes as she ran the ridgeline above the ruin until the bond ache was something she could manage again. When she shifted back, something else was running alongside the ache, something she didn't have a name for yet, something that lived in the space where the bond had been bright and was now dimmed. Not empty, not yet, but different. Changed, like the landscape that appears when a flood recedes. Different terrain than what was there before. Older, harder, more honest about what it was. She sat with it in the cold and the dark and the dying fire, and she turned it over the way you turned over an unfamiliar object, examining it from every angle. On the third day, she hit the first rogue territory. Not Ashford yet. This was rougher, less organized, the kind of settlement that existed on the edges of places with actual names. 4 structures built into a hillside, smoke coming from 2 of them. Dogs, not wolves, actual dogs, who set up a racket when she came within 50 yards. The man who came out was large, weathered to leather, with the particular eyes of someone who had lived past 40 in a place that killed most people by 30. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Blackthorn exile?" he said. She registered the word. The specific category it put her in, the assumptions that came with it, broken, discarded, probably useless. "Traveler," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been warmer. "Ashford?" "Ashford." He pointed northeast. "Day and a half. Stay on the ridge. Easier going than the valley floor this time of year." He paused. "There's wolves 2 ridges east running hard territory, not the friendly kind." "I know what unfriendly looks like." He looked at her again with those 30-year eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Looks like." He went back inside. She stayed on the ridge. On the morning of the 4th day, she came down out of the heights and saw Ashford below her in a valley that the hills wrapped around like hands around a flame. It was not impressive by southern standards. No great hall, no keep, no managed streets. It was maybe 40 structures of varying permanence, a central fire that seemed to burn continuously. Wolves moving between buildings with the particular body language of people who had decided this was their ground and were willing to defend it from whatever came next. She stood on the hillside and looked down at it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not safety. She didn't know enough yet for safety, but possibility. The specific quality of a place that was outside the Empire's calculation, A place that didn't know what she'd been, only what she was. She went down. The woman called Rook found her before she found Rook. She became aware of being tracked about 300 yards from the village perimeter. That particular prickling awareness between the shoulder blades that 11 years of scouting had taught her to trust absolutely. She didn't speed up or slow down. She just kept walking and said without turning around, "Bessa says the winner owes me a debt." Silence for a moment. Then footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate, and a woman came up alongside her. Rook was not what she'd expected, which meant she should have expected exactly this. Short, compact, dark-haired, somewhere between 40 and 60, with the particular agelessness of people who'd stopped worrying about what year it was. Her eyes were the color of old ice, and they moved over Celine with the specific efficiency of someone who had been assessing threats and assets since before Celine was born. "Bessa," Rook said. "She said you'd know what it meant." "I know what it means." Rook kept walking alongside her, not threatening, just present. Frostvale Girl by the Scent came from the south last night's direction, dressed like someone raided the wrong supply wagon. A pause. Blackthorn Exile. Traveler. That's what they all say for the first week. Rook said it without mockery. Just fact. After that, some of them keep saying it and some of them stop. The ones who keep saying it usually leave again. The ones who stop... She shrugged. "Well..." They walked in silence for a moment. "I can work," Celine said. "I can scout, run logistics, manage supply chains. I can fight, hand-to-hand and wolf. I have 4 years of border scouting experience and 2 years running intelligence for a war council." "Whose war council?" She kept her voice level. "Blackthorn." Rook didn't stop walking, didn't change her pace or her expression, just absorbed this the way old rocks absorbed weather. "That's interesting," she said. "I'm not a spy." "I know. You can't possibly know that." "Spies don't lead with their vulnerabilities," Rook said. "They lead with usefulness and save the uncomfortable truth for never or very late. You led with Blackthorn in the first 2 minutes." A sideways glance. "Whatever happened to you down there was recent." Celine said nothing. "Coronation was 2 nights ago," Rook said. "It wasn't a question. Word travels, even up here. Word about the new Alpha King travels fast, especially to people who make a practice of paying attention to what Blackthorn does." She paused. "The story we got involved a Luna, publicly rejected." The cold in Celine's chest had nothing to do with the temperature. "You want me to confirm or deny something," she said. "I want nothing from you at this moment except to know one thing." Rook stopped walking. She turned and looked at Celine directly, those old ice eyes absolutely level. "Are you here because you have nowhere else to go?" Celine met her gaze. "I'm here because I'm not done," she said. Something shifted in Rook's expression. Not warmth exactly. More like the adjustment of a very accurate instrument that has just taken a measurement and found it consistent with expectations. "All right," Rook said. She started walking again. "You'll sleep in the East Longhouse tonight. Tomorrow I put you to work. I'll know within a week what you're actually capable of. Not what you say you're capable of, what you actually are." She glanced over. "We run 8 rogue clans through this valley. Some of them are exactly what they look like. Some of them are something else. You'll figure out which is which." Another pause. "Everyone here carries what the South threw away. Doesn't make them broken. Makes them particular." "I understand. I don't think you do yet. Not unkind, just accurate. But you will." Ashford opened up around them. Wolves looked up from tasks, assessed her with the specific directness of people who had given up on social performance in favor of pure functionality. Children ran. Someone was butchering an elk near the central fire, and the smell of it, blood and cold air and smoke, was the most real thing she'd encountered in 4 days. She was here. Celine Frostvale, former Luna of Blackthorn Keep, exiled to the place where unwanted things went to disappear, stood in the center of a rogue settlement at the edge of the known world, and felt the mate bond pulse once, faint and distant, like a signal from a ship already past the horizon. She let it go. Not forever. She couldn't do that yet, and she wouldn't lie to herself about it. But for now. For today. She had work to do. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, not Rook, not the clans, not the empire sprawling south of the border marker, Not Darius Blackthorn wearing his crown in the keep she'd helped him hold, was what was sleeping inside her blood. She didn't know about the first lunar queen. She didn't know that the cold of the north wasn't killing her the way it killed others, that her body was adapting faster than made sense, that her wolf was changing at the cellular level, that something ancient was waking up in response to the cold and the grief and the bone-deep fury that had no temperature at all. She didn't know yet. But on the third night in Ashford, when she woke at the second hour from a dream she couldn't remember with frost on her skin where no frost should have been able to form, inside under the blankets on her own body heat, and looked at her hands in the darkness and saw them glowing faint silver white, like moonlight trapped in flesh, she thought, something is happening to me. And somewhere in the oldest part of her, in the place below thought and below wolf and below anything the Empire had ever touched or named or owned, something answered back. What just woke up inside Celine Frostvale's blood? And does it have anything to do with why Darius really destroyed her that night? The frost on her skin didn't melt. That was the thing that held her in place. Sitting upright in the dark of the East Longhouse, blankets pooled around her waist, the cold of the northern night pressing flat against the walls. Because frost on skin melted. That was a physical law, not a preference. Body heat was body heat. It did what it did. Frost in contact with living skin at normal temperature had one option and one option only, and disappearing was not it. The frost on the backs of her hands was not melting. Celine held them up, turned them slowly. The glow was dimmer now than it had been in the first seconds after waking, dropping from that sharp silver white to something more like the phosphorescence you occasionally saw in deep water, faint and sourceless, and deeply wrong by any ordinary accounting. The frost sat in the creases of her knuckles and the webbing between her fingers in delicate crystalline formations that she recognized from the ridgeline surfaces she'd crossed yesterday. Not skin frost. Ice frost. The real kind. She pressed her right thumb against her left palm. Warm. Her body temperature was entirely normal. The frost was coming from outside the warmth. Or through it. Or both. Which made no sense. Which was perhaps the point. Around her in the longhouse, 7 other wolves slept the dense, flat sleep of people whose bodies were doing the work of surviving cold. Nobody stirred. The central fire had banked down to coals. Outside, the wind was having a conversation with the roof beams in the low register that northern structures developed after enough winters. She closed her hands into fists. The glow died. The frost cracked off in small pieces that hit the blanket and disappeared before they landed. Like they'd never been there, like the whole thing was a question the dark had asked and then immediately retracted. She sat with her fists closed in her lap and breathed through her nose and listened to the sleepers around her and thought with the particular precision of someone who had learned that panic was a resource expenditure you couldn't always afford. Something is happening to me, and I don't know what it is, and not knowing is information. She lay back down. She did not sleep again, but she lay still and let her body rest and used the remaining hours of dark to do an inventory of the last 4 days at the cellular level. Every strange moment she'd dismissed as cold stress or grief response, or the general unreliability of a body pushed past its limits. The way the temperature had stopped bothering her somewhere around the second day, not through acclimatization, but through something that felt more like accommodation, as though the cold had decided to negotiate. The way her wolf had changed during that hour of running the ridgeline. Something in the shift itself different, the return to skin leaving traces that didn't usually persist. The dream she couldn't remember but that had left her body feeling like a plucked string still vibrating. She cataloged it all, filed it under, unknown, priority, do not discuss. At dawn she got up and went to work. Rook had not been joking about the assessment. The woman ran Ashford with the specific methodology of someone who had long ago stopped distinguishing between efficiency and survival, because in her experience they were the same thing. The first task she assigned Celine was a perimeter check, a 12-mile circuit of the valley's high points, marking wind direction and animal sign and any evidence of human passage. Standard scout work, the kind of thing that told an experienced observer less about the terrain and more about how the new person moved through it. Celine did it in 4 hours instead of the expected 7. She came back with a map, hand-drawn on the back of a piece of supply parchment she'd found in the longhouse, that included 3 things Rook hadn't asked for and clearly hadn't expected. a secondary entrance through the eastern rock face that the current perimeter didn't account for, a water source 2 miles north that the valley wasn't using, and evidence of a wolf pack passage 3 days old moving west to east across the ridge. Rook looked at the map for a long time. The eastern gap, she said, wide enough for 2 wolves moving fast, not defensible from the current layout. We knew about the gap, then someone decided it wasn't a problem. Someone was wrong. Rook set the map on the table. The pack sign? What direction were they moving? East. Fast. The spacing said they weren't ranging, they were relocating. Something pushed them off their territory. A pause. Or someone. Rook looked up. The Grey Wolf clan has been pushing their border east for 6 months. We've been watching it. If they've pushed the wild packs off that ridge, they've effectively claimed the high ground on your northeastern approach. I know what they've claimed. Celine met her gaze. What are you doing about it? It was a direct question, and she knew it read as presumptuous. A 4-day arrival telling a woman who'd held this territory for decades what her problems were. But she'd learned from 2 years in a war council that the most expensive thing in any strategic situation was the politely unasked question, and she didn't have enough resources here to pay that cost. Rook looked at her for a long beat with those old ice eyes. Right now, Rook said slowly, I'm deciding whether you're an asset or a complication. I've been both before. I imagine you have. Rook picked up the map again. Eat. There's a council meeting at midday. You'll sit in. She sat in. The council was 7 people, and none of them were what the South would have called leaders. They were what long winters made. Specialists in staying alive. An older male called Bram, who managed the valley's hunting territories with the focused intensity of a man who understood that every calorie had a name. A younger woman, Iris, who handled medical supplies and knew more about infection and frostbite than any physician Celine had encountered in the Empire. 3 others whose roles were less defined but whose presence suggested the kind of lateral authority that emerged in places where survival required collective competence rather than hierarchy. And 1 more. Sitting at the end of the table, not speaking, not taking up any more space than necessary, a man whose wolf she clocked the moment she walked in, because it was the kind of wolf you clocked automatically. Large. Old. The specific quality of power that had been carried for a long time and had stopped needing to announce itself. He was younger than his wolf suggested. Late 30s, maybe, dark-haired, with a scar running jaw to temple on the left side that had healed without care. He watched her walk in with the flat, measuring attention of someone who assessed threats for a living and hadn't decided yet which category she occupied. Rook introduced her without ceremony. Celine Frostvale blood, Blackthorn trained. She's been here 4 days and she already found the East Gap problem. Everybody be honest about what we've got going on. The man at the end of the table said, She's Blackthorn exile. She's sitting right here, Celine said. His eyes moved to her. The quality of the attention didn't change. Still flat, still measuring, but something in it sharpened at the directness. Cade, Rook said, which Celine understood to be his name and a mild warning simultaneously. Blackthorn exiles come in 2 types, Cade said, still looking at Celine. The ones who break and the ones who've been sent to watch. I gave you a map with your security gap on it, Celine said. If I was here to watch, I'd have let you keep not knowing about the East approach. Or that's exactly what a smart observer does in the first week. Makes herself useful. So what's the version of this conversation where you believe me? He was quiet for a moment. Don't know yet. Then we're in the same position, she said. I don't know if this council is worth working with yet either. We're both making assessments. The only difference is I'm saying it out loud. Something happened at the edges of Cade's expression. Not quite a reaction, more the absence of the suppression of one. Rook moved the meeting forward with the pragmatic authority of a woman who had spent years managing the egos of damaged wolves and had developed an efficient technique for it. She simply began talking about something else, and the force of her focus pulled the room along. The Grey Wolf situation was, as Celine had suspected from the map evidence, worse than anyone was officially saying. 6 months of eastern pressure had cost Ashford 2 hunting ranges and an indirect trade route. 3 of the smaller rogue settlements in the northeastern valley had already been absorbed, not by violence exactly, but by the specific coercive hospitality of a larger power that arrived and didn't leave. They want this valley, Iris said. They've always wanted this valley. Better water, better shelter, central position in the Northern Territories. What stopped them so far? Celine asked. Us, Bram said flatly. What specifically about you? The fact that taking Ashford by force has a cost. Rook's voice. We've made sure the cost is high enough that they've preferred the slow approach. Pressure instead of attack. Wait until we're weak enough that the cost drops. Are you weakening? The silence around the table was the answer. We lost 12 wolves last winter, Iris said quietly. Illness and cold. We've got 7 pups this cycle. The numbers aren't... She stopped. The Grey Wolf clan is running 60-plus wolves, Cade said. He was looking at Celine now with an attention that had shifted slightly, still measuring, but measuring something different. What did Blackthorn teach you about asymmetric defense? It was the first thing he'd asked her directly. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said that the resource-poor defender wins by making every engagement more expensive than the resource-rich attacker budgets for. You don't match force with force. You match force with consequence. And if the attacker decides the consequence is acceptable, then you change what the consequence is. He held her gaze. How? By making sure they can never fully predict what it will be. She paused. The East Gap isn't just a vulnerability. It's an option. If Grey Wolf thinks they've found your soft approach and they move through it, and what they find on the other side isn't what they expected, you want to use it as a trap, Rook said. I want to use it as a message. There's a difference. Around the table, the quality of attention had shifted. She felt it. The specific recalibration of people who have been carrying a problem alone for too long and are suddenly aware that someone else can see its shape. She'd felt this before. In the War Council. In the tent briefings before border operations. The moment when the room understood that the person speaking was not just describing the problem, but had already begun solving it. She hadn't thought about whether she missed it. She found she had. Rook set down her cup. You'll work with Cade on the Eastern Defense, starting tomorrow. Cade said nothing. He looked at Celine with those flat measuring eyes, and she looked back, and neither of them agreed to anything out loud, which was, in its own way, an agreement. The council ended. She was 3 steps out the door when Cade's voice came from behind her. Frostvale. She stopped but didn't turn immediately. Old habit. You didn't show that the voice behind you had any power to stop you until you'd decided it did. She turned. He was in the doorway, arms crossed, the scar on his jaw catching the pale northern light. The East Gap solution, he said. You thought of that on the perimeter walk, didn't you? Not here. Yes. 12 miles in 4 hours producing a tactical map. That's not scout work pace, that's command pace. His eyes didn't waver. What were you in Blackthorn? Luna elect. She said it flat and clean and watched his face for the specific reaction people had to that word now. The pity, or the contempt, or the calculating recalibration. She'd seen all 3 in 4 days. She was beginning to be able to predict which type she was talking to within the first 30 seconds. Cade's face did something she hadn't cataloged yet. It went very still. Luna elect, he repeated, past tense. I know what past tense means. He was quiet for a moment. You ran his intelligence operation. I contributed to it. That's not a denial. No, she said. It's not. Another silence. He looked at her the way you looked at a locked door when you were trying to decide if you had the right key. The Grey Wolf clan, he said, their alpha, Sarek, was at the Blackthorn coronation as a guest dignitary. He's been building east for 3 years because someone in the Southern Empire told him Ashford was strategically significant and currently vulnerable. He paused. You know anything about that? The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the northern air. She stood with it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, what specifically did they tell him? That the exile route north was about to bring him a problem. The words settled into the air between them, and she watched them land and felt something happen in her chest. That was neither the bond nor the frost glow, but something older and more simple. The specific comprehension of a person who has just understood that what she thought was an ending was actually the opening move in a longer game. He sent her here. He sent her here knowing, not to disappear, not from cruelty, or not only from cruelty. He sent her north because something in the north was useful to someone, and removing her to this specific location was part of a calculation she hadn't seen the full shape of yet. Or someone had told him to. "How long have you known?" she said. 3 days. "You let me do the perimeter walk anyway. I needed to know if you were worth the problem you brought with you." She held his gaze. "And?" He looked at her for a long moment with that unreadable stillness. "You found the East Gap," he said, "on day 1. 12 miles in 4 hours. Produced a tactical map nobody asked for. Then you sat in council and identified a solution that took me 6 months to get close to." He unfolded his arms. "You're worth the problem." "That's not a compliment." "No," he said. "It's an assessment." He went back inside. She stood in the cold outside the council house and looked north, where the sky was the particular white of weather building on the horizon, and let herself understand the full shape of what she was standing in. She had been exiled to a location that had been flagged as strategically significant. She had been sent there knowing a hostile clan was already applying pressure. Whether the intent was to remove her permanently through someone else's hand, or to use her as a destabilizing element, or something else entirely, she didn't know yet. What she knew was that she was inside someone's longer game, and the only acceptable response to that was to understand the game well enough to stop being a piece in it, to become the player instead. She thought of Darius in his coronation armor, that resolved face, the calculation behind those iron-gray eyes. She thought, if you wanted me gone, you had options. You chose this one. She thought, why? She didn't have the answer yet, but she had a direction, which was something. She went to find Cade. He was behind the council house, splitting wood with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd been doing it long enough that his body handled it without consulting his mind. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched for a moment time, not the work, but him, the way he moved, the specific quality of his presence in space. His wolf ran close to the surface. She could feel it from 6 feet away, that old and large energy, the kind that had seen enough that it no longer felt the need to posture. "You were a commander," she said. He didn't stop splitting. "Was. Where?" "Doesn't matter." "It does if I'm working with you." He set the axe and turned. "Marin territories. Before the consolidation." A pause, flat and deliberate. "Before Blackthorn swallowed them." Ah. There it was. She stood with that for a moment. Darius's father had consolidated the Marin territories through a combination of military pressure and political coercion that the Southern histories described as an alliance, and the people who'd lived through it described differently. Bessa had mentioned it on the wagon. Cade's face told her everything about which description he'd experienced firsthand. "Then you have more reason to let Grey Wolf have this valley than to fight for it," she said. His jaw tightened. "I'm still here." "I know. I'm asking why." He looked at her for a long beat. "Because what's mine is mine," he said. The simplicity of it was total. No justification, no elaboration, just a statement of fact with the weight of everything that had shaped it. "Blackthorn took the Marin lands. I won't hand this one to Grey Wolf because the math looks bad." His eyes held hers. "You understand that?" It wasn't a question. He was reading her the way she'd been reading him, and he'd arrived at a conclusion. "Yes," she said. "Then we work together." "We work together." He nodded once, the kind of nod that closed a door and opened a different one, and picked up the axe again. She stayed in the yard. "The thing Sarek was told about this location," she said. "The intelligence about Ashford's vulnerability. I need to know the source, if you can get it. Asking me to spy on the people trying to kill us? Asking you to find out if what happened to me and what's happening here are the same operation." He set the axe again, looked at her with that measuring stillness. "If they are," he said. "Then the person running the operation made a mistake," she said. "They sent me to the exact place where I'd find out about it." Something moved in Cade's eyes then. Still not warm. He wasn't that, and she didn't think he was built for it anymore. And she understood that without judgment because she recognized the same architecture in herself. The thing that happened to people when warmth had been used as a vector of damage enough times that the body quietly stopped producing it for strangers. But it was something. An acknowledgement. "I'll make contact with one of the Grey Wolf border wolves," he said. "There's one who's been running the line between their territory and ours for 2 months. I don't think he's a true believer. He runs it with the eyes of a man who's working a job, not a cause. Good. Those are the ones who'll talk if the price is right. What's our price? She thought for a moment. Information for information. We tell him something that makes him valuable to Sarek. Something true but small. Something that costs us nothing. He feels like an insider. Then we ask questions. Cade was quiet, absorbing this. That's the kind of thing you learned in the War Council, he said. Yes. Not the kind of thing they teach pack defenders. No. Another silence. The particular kind that formed around a thing when two people were both looking at it clearly for the first time. You're building something, he said. You walked into this valley 4 days ago with nothing and you're already building something. She met his gaze. So are you. You've been building it for years. You just needed a different tool. Is that what you are? Right now? Yes. She held his eyes. Ask me again in 6 months. He looked at her for a long moment with those old, flat measuring eyes. Then he said, split wood with me. I think better when my hands are working. She picked up the second axe and split wood with him for an hour, and they talked. And by the end of it, she understood that what Cade had built in Ashford was not simply a rogue settlement. It was a structure. Rough, incomplete, functioning on will and winter more than anything elegant, but a structure. 8 clans moving through the northern valleys with loose coordination, a shared understanding of threat and resource, the embryonic shape of something that could become, with the right pressure applied in the right places, something considerably more. He'd been thinking about it for years. She could hear it in how he talked about the clans. Not as separate units, but as a system, the way you talked about something you'd been mapping in your head long enough that the map had started to feel like reality. He just hadn't had the strategic vocabulary for it, the framework that turned instinct into operation. She had exactly that. 2 years of it, learned in the Empire's own war room, used to serve a king who'd thrown her away. She thought, with a cold precision that felt almost like satisfaction, he trained me for this. He just didn't know who he was training me for. The frost came back that night, not on her skin this time. She woke before it reached the surface. Some animal awareness catching the pre-signal, the sensation of cold building from inside outward rather than outside in. She sat up in the dark of the longhouse and pressed both hands flat against the earthen floor and breathed with deliberate control and pushed it back down. It went. Reluctantly, like something that had been expecting more space and was being told the space wasn't available yet. She sat in the dark after. She was not afraid of it. That was the thing she noted most carefully. The absence of fear, which was either courage or a more profound kind of damage, and she wasn't certain which. But the cold that lived in her blood, whatever it was and wherever it came from, did not feel like threat. It felt like... She searched for the word, found it uncomfortable, used it anyway. Inheritance. Like something that had always been there and was only now figuring out that the door was open. She didn't know what the first Lunar Queen was. She barely knew the stories. Northern myths, the kind the Empire dismissed as rogue clan superstition. Tales of a wolf woman who'd walked the ice before kingdoms existed, who'd carried the cold itself as a weapon, whose bloodline had scattered into the frozen territories centuries ago. She filed it under unknown, priority, do not discuss. And then, because she was alone in the dark, and there was no strategic cost to honesty, she kept entirely internal. She amended it to unknown, priority, figure out before anyone else does. On the 8th day, the gray wolf border wolf made contact. He was young, early 20s, broad-built, with the nervous energy of someone operating at the edge of his loyalty's comfortable boundary. Cade had been right about the job, not a cause quality. Celine watched him from the ridge as he made his circuit and identified it in the first 3 minutes. He was careful and competent and completely unprepared for the fact that someone had been watching him as carefully as he'd been watching them. She came down off the ridge at the point in his circuit where the trees provided cover from both directions. She stepped out of the tree line 10 feet in front of him and stood still. He stopped. His hand went to the blade at his hip. "Don't," she said. "I'm not here for trouble. I'm here for a conversation." He assessed her with quick, scanning eyes, young enough that he hadn't developed the full stoic mask yet. She could read him like a page. Threat evaluation, retreat calculation. The specific pause when a trained fighter determines that the person in front of them is also trained, and the math changes. "You're the new one," he said. From Ashford. Yes? Blackthorn exile. She was beginning to find the frequency with which people led with this either exhausting or clarifying. This time, it felt like the second. What do you know about why I was exiled? Something flickered in his eyes. Nothing. You paused before that answer. His jaw tightened. He was 23, maybe 24, and he wasn't built for interrogation yet. Sarek mentioned it, he said finally, at the winter briefing, said there'd be a high-value exile coming north. Said it was an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man standing at a door he hadn't intended to open. The kind that makes the Southern Empire's problem become our territory, he said. There it was. She stood with it. The cold in her blood ran absolutely still, the way deep water ran still under ice. Surface calm, everything moving below. Who told Sarek about the exile before it happened? She said. He shook his head. I don't have that. Who would? His inner council. Maybe 2 people. He paused. His alliance contact. He has an alliance contact in the south. Not a question. He answered it anyway. Has for a year. Don't know who. The communication comes through a coded courier system. I move the packages sometimes. I don't read them. She looked at him for a long moment. What's your name? He hesitated. Then, Finn. Finn, she said. What I'm about to tell you is true and verifiable and worth something to Sarek, a water source 2 miles north of Ashford's Valley. It's been unused because the route is exposed. In 2 weeks, we're going to run a supply line through there. If Sarek wants to know our supply routes, that's one. Finn's eyes moved over her with the rapid calculation of a young man figuring out if he was being set up. Why are you giving me this? Because I want something in return, she said. Next time you move a package from Sarek's alliance contact, I want to know the courier mark, the identifying sign on the seal or the packaging, something I can trace. If Sarek finds out, he won't. She held his gaze. Unless you tell him, and you won't, because you're running the line between his territory and Ashford's with the eyes of a man who's already calculating his exit. He went very still. You've been watching me a long time, he said. 8 days. She paused. Long enough? He looked at her with something she recognized, the specific quality of a person who has been seen accurately by someone they didn't expect to be seen by, and who is trying to decide if that's threat or relief. I'll look at the next package, he said. She turned and walked back toward the tree line. The Blackthorn exile thing, Finn said behind her. Sarek said it like it meant you were damaged, that the North would finish what the king started. She stopped. She turned. She looked at him across the distance between them and let him see her face clearly. Let him see what 4 days of cold and 8 days of work and a fury with no temperature at all had built in the 30 hours since she'd watched the frost glow from her own hands in the dark. Tell Sarek, she said, that damaged things have edges. She went back up the ridge. She made it back to Ashford in 2 hours and found Cade at the Eastern Gap, doing what she'd done 8 days ago, studying the terrain with the particular attention of someone turning a problem over. She came up beside him. He'll look at the next package, she said. Cade was quiet for a moment. You trust him? I trust his situation. He wants out. That's enough for now. And if the courier mark leads back to someone in the Southern Empire? She looked out at the Eastern Gap, the rock face beyond it, the northern sky building toward weather again. Then I'll know who orchestrated the exile, she said. Who told Darius to send me here, or who used his decision to set this in motion? A pause. And I'll know what they want from this valley. Cade turned to look at her. She didn't look back. She was watching the gap, thinking about what lived on the other side of it. The Grey Wolf territory, the Southern Empire, the long web of connected decisions that had placed her in this exact spot. The frost in her blood was running still and cold and patient. There are stories, Cade said, about the northern bloodlines, the old ones, before the Empire standardized everything and decided what wolves were and weren't. She said nothing. Stories about a line that carried something different, not just alpha strength. He paused. Something older. She felt the frost shift slightly in her chest, like a signal. I've heard the stories, she said. Have you? I filed them under superstition. And now? She was quiet for a long moment. Now I'm revising my filing system, she said. The weather that had been building on the northern horizon all day broke that evening. Not the manageable cold she'd been navigating for 8 days, but something harder. The kind of storm that the north threw at everything periodically to remind the living that it was tolerating their presence, not endorsing it. She stood at the longhouse door and watched it come in. The storm front moved across the valley like something deliberate, and at the exact moment it crossed the tree line above Ashford and the first hard blast of wind hit the settlement, every wolf in the vicinity felt it. The atmospheric pressure drop, the energy shift, the way extreme weather engaged the animal brain's most basic circuitry. Her wolf rose hard, not with fear, but something else. Something that reached toward the storm the way you reach toward something familiar. The frost in her blood ran bright. Just for a second. Just long enough to be real. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and breathed through it, pushed it back, maintained the surface. Around her, wolves were moving to secure shelters and check on the young. Normal storm response. Nobody looked at her. But in that second, in that bright, cold second, she had felt something she couldn't unfeel. The cold wasn't coming from outside her. It never had been. She'd been reading it wrong since the first night, mapping it as intrusion when it was activation. The storm hadn't triggered it. It had recognized it. As like calling to like, reaching across the gap between sky and skin for something that turned out to already be there. She stepped back from the door. She thought, with as careful precision of someone who has just identified a weapon they didn't know they were carrying. I need to understand what I am before someone else figures it out first. She thought, because whoever sent me north knew something about this valley, and something about me, and those two facts are connected, and the connection is the answer. She thought, and when I have the answer, nothing about what comes next will look like what anyone planned. The storm hit the valley full force, and inside it, in the old longhouse that smelled of wood smoke and survival, Celine Frostvale sat with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap, and felt the cold in her blood burning like a second heart, patient and ancient and absolutely without mercy. And somewhere in the south, in the War Council chamber of Blackthorn Keep, a sealed message arrived for the new king bearing a courier mark that matched exactly the mark on the packages Finn had been moving through the northern line for a year. And the name beneath the seal was one that Darius Blackthorn had trusted without question since the day he took the throne. The Empire's most dangerous secret isn't in the frozen north. It's been sitting at the king's right hand the entire time. The storm lasted 3 days. Not unusual for the north in this season. Rook had said as much when Celine asked, that flat, pragmatic tone she used for facts that required no editorial, just acknowledgement. 3 days of wind that came off the high ridges like something with intent, packing snow into every gap and joint and exposed surface, until Ashford looked less like a settlement and more like the land's attempt to reclaim what had briefly been borrowed from it. They worked through it. That was the rhythm of the place. Weather was not an interruption, it was a condition, and you adjusted your operation accordingly. Supply checks, structural reinforcement, the careful managed burn of fuel reserves. Celine ran inventory on the Eastern Longhouse stores and found 3 separate accounting errors that had been accumulating quietly for months. The kind of slow bleed that didn't look like anything critical until the moment it was. She fixed them. Filed the corrections with Bram, who looked at the revised numbers with the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight without knowing exactly how heavy it was, and had just been handed the measurement. He said, "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" She said, "Long enough?" He nodded and didn't ask more, and that was the particular economy of Ashford that she was beginning to understand. People here didn't ask for more than the answer that was actually given. They'd all learned, in their various ways, that surplus information was another kind of exposure. On the second night of the storm, Rook came and sat beside her at the inventory table and didn't say anything for a while. Just sat. Celine had learned in 2 weeks that this was how Rook approached things that required careful handling. She arrived first and established presence before she brought the thing itself, which was either wisdom or an old habit that had calcified into technique. "You're not sleeping well," Rook said finally. "I'm sleeping fine. You're sleeping functionally. There's a difference." A pause. "Your hands have been cold since you arrived. Colder than the temperature accounts for." Celine set down her counting stick. "How long have you been noticing that?" she said. "Since day 2. Rook's voice was unhurried. I've been in the North a long time, Celine. I've seen what it does to people who aren't built for it, and I've seen what it does to people who are. A beat. And I've seen one other thing. Once, 30 years ago. A woman who came up from the old border territories with nothing but a rogue's mark on her wrist and cold light in her skin. The frost in Celine's blood ran absolutely still. What happened to her, she asked. Rook was quiet for a moment. She became something the North needed her to be. Another pause. It cost her everything she'd planned on being instead. Celine looked at the inventory numbers without seeing them. That's not a comforting story, she said. It wasn't meant to be. Rook stood. Whatever's in your blood, don't fight it in the dark alone. That's how it breaks the wrong way. She left. Celine sat at the table for a long time after, listening to the storm work on the walls. The frost pulsed once, slow and deep, like a second heartbeat finding its rhythm. She didn't push it back this time. She just let it be there, let it run its slow cold current through her chest and down her arms to her hands, and watched the air directly above her palms develop that faint silver phosphorescence, and breathed and thought, all right, I hear you. Nothing answered in words, but something settled, like a tension releasing that she'd been holding so long she'd forgotten the holding. On the third day the storm broke. Finn was waiting at the eastern approach. She saw him from 200 yards. He'd positioned himself in the open, which was either stupidity or the specific body language of a man who wanted to be seen approaching cleanly, no cover, no ambiguity. He was standing with his hands visible and his face toward Ashford, and the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the consequences of it. She came down without Cade. She'd considered bringing him and decided against it. Finn had given her the border wolf information without other witnesses, and something in the dynamic of that first conversation suggested he'd close up under an audience. She stopped 10 feet from him. You have something, she said. He looked at her with eyes that had aged since their first meeting. Not dramatically, just the specific compression of someone who had done something that crossed a line in their own accounting and was now on the other side of it, learning what the view looked like. The package came through yesterday, he said, morning of the second storm day. I run the eastern route. I'm supposed to pass them to a relay wolf at the tree line who takes them south. But the relay didn't show. Storm pushed him out 2 hours. I had the package in my hands for those 2 hours. He paused. I looked at the seal. And he reached into his coat and produced a small piece of rough bark. He'd made a rubbing of the seal, pressing charcoal into the impression and lifting the mark. She took it. She looked at it. The mark was a sigil, not the Grey Wolf clan's territorial mark, which she knew from the boundary stones she'd catalogued on the perimeter walk. This was something else, a paired set of lines crossing at a specific angle, with a small distinctive notch cut into the upper left quadrant. The kind of mark a house or a family used for private correspondence. The kind you didn't see in official documentation because it was specifically designed for communications that official documentation could never acknowledge. She knew this mark. She stood in the cold 10 feet from Finn and looked at the charcoal rubbing and felt the world do something quiet and total. Not a dramatic shift, not the ground opening, just the specific internal reorganization of a person who has just acquired the piece that makes every previously confusing thing suddenly horribly legible. Lord Carver. The mark was Lord Carver's private house sigil. She'd seen it once, 18 months ago, on a courier packet she'd processed for the War Council's internal routing, one of the 40 administrative tasks she'd absorbed in the first months at Blackthorn, because absorbing administrative tasks was how you learned where the power actually ran versus where everyone said it ran. Huldren Carver, Darius's oldest council member, the man who'd been at Blackthorn's war table since before Darius's father died, the man who'd patted her on the shoulder 3 weeks before the coronation and said she'd be a fine Luna. The man who had looked deliberately away when she walked out of the Great Hall. She understood now why he'd looked away. Not from discomfort, from the specific kind of studied neutrality a person performed when they've arranged what they're witnessing and don't want their face to register the outcome check. He'd arranged it, not just the exile. The destination, the specific northern location where Grey Wolf was already applying pressure, where her arrival would either be absorbed and disappeared, or would destabilize the valley in ways that served his longer operation. Either way, Carver won. If the North killed her, an inconvenient intelligence asset was gone. If Grey Wolf used her arrival as the pretext to move on Ashford, the northern rogue settlements got consolidated under a clan that Carver had been corresponding with for a year. And if neither of those things happened, if she was still standing and thinking clearly after 2 weeks in the cold, well, she suspected he hadn't fully accounted for that option. People who moved other people like pieces tended to underestimate the pieces. "The relay wolf," she said. Her voice came out level. She was noting this with one part of her mind, the part that ran the inventory of her own function, because level was not what she felt. What she felt was the cold in her blood running so still it had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like the total opposite of fire. "The relay who was supposed to take the package south. What do you know about him?" "Name's Gret. Runs 3 routes between the northern line and the Empire border. He's not Grey Wolf. He's independent. Paid work." "Has he been running this specific route for a year?" Finn thought. "About that, yes." "And the package goes where, after Gret?" "I don't know the full chain. I assumed it went to Sarek's contact in the south." She looked at the rubbing again. "It does. It goes to Lord Carver's private messenger network and then into Blackthorn Keep's back channels." She paused. "Sarek isn't running a contact in the south. He's being run by one." Finn was quiet for a moment. "That changes what I thought this was." "What did you think it was?" "Sarek building an alliance, working both sides." "It's not an alliance," she said. "Sarek is an instrument. Carver has been using the Grey Wolf clan's territorial ambition to destabilize the northern settlements for a year. When the settlements fragment, Blackthorn has justification for a northern military campaign. They absorb the territories. The trade routes through the northern valleys, the ones Ashford sits in the center of, become Empire property. She could see Finn doing the math in real time, the specific face of someone whose entire understanding of their own situation has just been reconfigured. "Sarek thinks he's gaining territory," Finn said. "Sarek thinks he's going to end up with Ashford and the Valley clans under his banner, with Blackthorn's tacit backing. What he's actually going to end up with is a military justification that the Empire will use to roll through the north and take everything, including Grey Wolf territory. He's being set up. He's a useful idiot with good instincts and bad information. Yes." She folded the rubbing and put it inside her coat. "And so was I." The last part she said quietly, almost to herself. Finn looked at her. "What are you going to do?" She looked north for a moment, then back at him. "What are you going to do?" "Because what you just did, making that rubbing, bringing it here, that's not someone running a line for a paycheck anymore." He held her gaze. His jaw was tight. 23 years old and standing at the intersection of 2 different futures, and he knew it. And she didn't try to make it easier because making it easier would be a kind of lie. "I'm done with Sarek," he said. "Saying that and surviving it are different problems." "I know." A beat. "I can get out before he knows I looked at the package. The relay didn't see me. I passed it off clean, but I can't go back to the Eastern line after this." She looked at him for a long moment. "Can you run courier routes?" "It's what I do." "I need a courier," she said. "Someone who knows the northern paths and can move between the valley settlements without looking like they're building a network. Someone who's done enough work for enough different parties that one more isn't suspicious." He was quiet. "It's not a safe job," she said. "None of them are." He looked at her with those newly aged eyes. "All right." She went back to Ashford and found Cade and told him everything. She told it straight, no softening, no diplomatic structuring. Just the sequence of information in the order she'd acquired it and what it meant in order. She'd learned in the War Council that the speed and accuracy of a briefing determined whether the person receiving it could make good decisions from it, and she was not interested in managing Cade's reaction. She was interested in his thinking. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he said, "Carver." "Yes." "He's been at that table since the previous king." "Yes." "Darius trusts him the way you trust the floor," Cade said. "Completely, without thinking about it, because the alternative is standing in the air." The image landed. She felt it land in her own chest, and she pressed it down, because what she felt about Darius Blackthorn's strategic vulnerabilities was not something she could afford to spend resources on right now. How long before Carver realizes Ashford isn't fragmenting the way he planned, she said, Cade thought. His timeline for the Northern campaign, if I had to guess from the pressure Grey Wolf's been running, maybe 4 months. 6 at the outside. He needs the Valley settlements visibly destabilized before he can justify the military push to the War Council. 4 months? Maybe less. If he sent you north as the destabilizing element, and it's been 2 weeks with no movement, he'll send something else, she said. Yes, she stood with that. The cold in her blood ran its patient current, and she let it run and thought about 4 months, and the 8 rogue clans that Cade had been quietly coordinating for years, and the East Gap in Ashford's perimeter and Finn, who could run northern courier routes, and the water source 2 miles north, and the inventory errors she'd already fixed, and the specific architecture of a thing that had been building without realizing what it was building toward. We need to move faster than we've been moving, she said. I know. The clan coordination you've been doing, the loose network. How loose? Loose enough that it's deniable, not loose enough that it's useless. I need it tighter. I need the 8 clans to know what they're part of, not just individually, collectively. They need to understand that they're not 8 separate small groups Carver can pick off one at a time. They're one entity that he has to calculate as a whole. Cade looked at her. To do that, I have to tell them about Carver. Yes. Some of them won't believe it. Some of them will panic. Some will. The ones who panic are the ones who've still got something to lose and haven't made peace with the math yet. She held his gaze. But some of them have been in the North long enough to know exactly what an empire does when it decides the frontier is worth taking. Those are the ones we talk to first. He was quiet again. That 30-second stillness that she'd learned meant he was doing the full calculation, not the quick version. Bram won't panic, he said finally. Tala of the Ironwood clan won't. The West Haven group. They were consolidated out of Marin territory 7 years ago. They've been waiting for something to be angry at that was actually worth the energy. A pause. Old Drev of the Coldwater clan is a harder read. He's survived 15 years in the northern valleys by never being visibly aligned with anything. He sounds like exactly the kind of person who knows how to commit quietly when the time is right, she said. What does he need to hear? He needs to hear that whatever he signs on to can actually win. The words sat in the air between them. Win. She felt the cold in her blood run bright for exactly 1 second. Not the slow, deep pulse of the last few days. Something sharper. Something that recognized a thing it had been waiting for. Then we give him something to believe in, she said. The next 10 days were the most purely operational of her life. Not the War Council work. That had been strategic, but never fully hers. Always filtered through the structure of someone else's priorities and someone else's final call. This was different. This was the specific freedom of a person who has stopped working inside someone else's architecture and started building the architecture itself. She and Cade split the clan outreach. He took the ones he'd been cultivating, Bram, the Ironwood clan, the West Haven group. And she took the harder reads, Drev of Coldwater, a clan leader named Sola who ran the northeastern valleys with 36 wolves and a reputation for shooting messengers, sometimes literally. 2 smaller settlements whose names didn't appear on any empire map because they'd made a practice of not being findable. She went to each of them the same way she'd gone to Finn, direct, no prelude. She laid out Carver's operation in clean, verifiable sequence, and then she stopped talking and let them sit with it. Drev of Coldwater was 60 years old and built like the landscape, compressed and permanent, with eyes that had seen enough cycles of northern winter to have stopped being surprised by anything. He sat across from her in his settlement's main building and listened to the briefing and then poured 2 cups of something that smelled aggressively medicinal and pushed one toward her. I've known something was moving in the south for 8 months, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her. How? Because a man with your survival record doesn't stay in the north for 15 years without having better intelligence than anyone gives him credit for. You've been watching the Grey Wolf pressure build and tracking its origin, and you haven't acted because acting unilaterally against an empire operation is a death sentence. She picked up the cup. But acting collectively isn't. He looked at her for a long time. You're the Blackthorn Luna. I was. Why should the people Blackthorn threw away trust someone who was Blackthorn's? It was the right question. She'd known it was coming, and she'd thought carefully about how to answer it because the wrong answer here was worse than no answer. You shouldn't trust me because I was Blackthorn's, she said. You should assess me on what I've done in 3 weeks in this valley and make your own calculation. She paused. But I'll tell you this, every piece of intelligence about Carver's operation that I've given you is verifiable. I've shown you the courier mark, I've given you the timeline, I've laid out the mechanism. If any of it doesn't check out, you walk away and I've cost you an afternoon. She held his gaze. And if it does check out, you're sitting on information that every clan in these valleys needs to have. Drev drank from his cup, set it down, looked at his hands for a moment. The Blackthorn exile, he said. Carver sent you north to neutralize you, or to use you. Yes. And instead you're building the thing he was trying to prevent. Yes. He looked up. The old weathered eyes had something in them she recognized. Not warmth, not enthusiasm, just the specific quality of a man who has waited a long time for something to be worth fighting for and is currently measuring what's in front of him against that standard. All right, he said. I'm in. Sola was harder. Sola was 45 and had a temper that ran close to the surface and a history with the Empire that was not something she spoke about but that Cade had briefed Celine on in 2 sentences. Family killed in the Marin Consolidation, survived by running north at 19, built her northeastern settlement through a combination of tactical ferocity and the specific discipline of someone who never again intended to be caught unprepared. She had 37 wolves. She had never lost a territorial dispute. She had never, as far as anyone knew, forgiven anything. She met Celine at this boundary of her settlement with 3 wolves flanking her and her arms crossed and her jaw set at the angle of a woman who has already composed her refusal and is waiting for the cue to deliver it. Celine stopped at 10 feet. The flanking wolves were large and attentive, and she noted their positioning with the professional part of her brain that never fully went off duty, but she didn't adjust her stance. Adjusting her stance would communicate threat assessment, and she wasn't here to be a threat. You have 2 minutes before I decide this was a waste of good cold, Sola said. Haldren Carver has been running Sarek of the Grey Wolf clan as an asset for 14 months, Celine said. The endgame is a northern military campaign that takes these valleys into Blackthorn territory. Sarek gets eliminated in the process. Every clan north of the border marker gets absorbed or destroyed. I have the courier mark. I have the timeline. I have a source inside the Grey Wolf operation who is now working with Ashford. She paused. That's 90 seconds. I'll use the last 30 to tell you that I know what happened to your family in the Marin Consolidation, and I know that walking into any room with the word Blackthorn in it is something you've sworn you'd never do again. I'm not asking you to walk into that room. I'm asking you to help make sure that room never gets built up here. Sola looked at her. The flanking wolves hadn't moved. Neither had Sola's expression exactly, but something had shifted behind it. The specific internal reorganization that Celine was beginning to recognize as a signature, the moment when a person's prepared position gets overridden by something that cuts deeper. You were their Luna, Sola said. I was. And they threw you out here? Yes. Why should that make me trust you more? It shouldn't, Celine said. Being discarded doesn't make a person trustworthy. What makes me trustworthy is that everything I've told you in the last 90 seconds is independently verifiable, and I've given you the tools to verify it. A beat. What makes me worth working with is that I spent 2 years inside that war council, and I know exactly how Carver thinks, and the clans in these valleys don't. Sola's jaw worked. The courier mark, she said. You have a physical copy? Celine produced the rubbing. Sola looked at it for a long time. Her jaw went very tight. She handed it back. I've seen that mark before, she said quietly. Celine went still. Where? On a communication my scout intercepted 6 months ago, moving through the northeastern pass. I couldn't read the content. It was sealed and encoded, and I wasn't going to break the seal of something I didn't have the context for. Sola's voice was flat, but her eyes had gone to a very particular place, the place where a person was reconstructing a timeline and didn't like what the reconstruction produced. I thought it was Empire Trade Intelligence, standard Southern monitoring of northern routes. It wasn't. No. Sola looked at her. It was him building his case. 6 months ago, he was already documenting northern vulnerability. He's been patient, Celine said. This operation has been running for over a year. He didn't rush it. He built it carefully. She paused. Which means he's done this before, possibly with the Marin territories. The air between them changed. Sola's eyes went through a sequence that Celine watched without speaking. The initial landing of the implication, the resistance to it, the testing of it against what she knew, the moment the testing came back consistent, and then the very particular cold fury of a person who has spent 26 years not knowing that the thing that destroyed their family was not chaos or conquest, but a patient, careful, administrative decision made by a man at a council table. Say that again, Sola said. I don't know for certain, Celine said, but the pattern is consistent. Patient groundwork, asset cultivation, manufactured justification, clean absorption. She held Sola's gaze. It's how he operates. The silence lasted a long time. I'm in, Sola said. Her voice had dropped to something that was barely above quiet and was entirely without ambiguity. Whatever you're building, I'm in. By the end of the 3rd week, 6 of the 8 clans had committed. Drev and Sola, Bram's Ashford contingent, the Ironwood clan, the West Haven group, a small fierce settlement called the Stonewater Pack, who had been running the high ridges for 20 years and who committed inside 3 minutes of hearing the Carver briefing because their leader, a woman who was entirely too calm to be safe, said that she'd been waiting for someone to name the shape of what had been moving in the south, and now that it had a name, she knew exactly what to do with it. 2 clans were still uncommitted, not hostile, just watching, waiting for something that would tip the calculation. She was at the Eastern Gap with Cade, running the terrain assessment for the 3rd time, when Finn arrived at a pace that was not his usual measured courier stride. She saw him from the ridge and knew immediately that something had broken. She came down fast. He was breathing hard, not exertion hard, something else. The specific respiratory pattern of a person running on adrenaline and bad information. Sarek knows about the rubbing, he said. The cold in her blood went absolutely flat. How? Gret, the relay wolf. He did show up, just late. He saw me at the tree line. I didn't know he'd seen me until this morning when one of the Grey Wolf border runners I know told me Sarek had put out a finding order. He exhaled hard. For me. And for the source inside Ashford, Cade said. He knows there's a source inside. Does he know it's her? He knows it's someone who arrived recently from the south. Finn looked at Celine. He's offering territory concessions to anyone in the valley settlements who turns in the Blackthorn exile. She stood with this, not shocked, not exactly. The calculation had always included the possibility of this timeline accelerating. What she felt was the specific sharpening that occurred when a problem that had been theoretical became immediate, when the time buffer collapsed and every decision became a present-tense decision with present-tense consequences. He'll move on Ashford, Cade said. Not immediately. He wants the source first. He doesn't know what information has already moved. He needs to assess the damage before he escalates to Carver. She was thinking out loud, which was something she rarely did, but Cade had proven he could track. If he escalates to Carver before he understands the scope, he's admitting to Carver that his operation has been compromised. He'll want to contain it first. That gives us days, maybe less. She looked at the Eastern Gap, then at Cade. We accelerate the remaining 2 clans. We're not forcing. We're giving them the current situation and letting them make an informed choice. Any clan that isn't committed when Sarek moves is going to have to make that choice under fire instead of in council. I'd rather they know that now. Cade looked at her for a long moment. And Carver? She held his gaze. This was the part she'd been turning over for 3 weeks, the part that lived underneath everything else. The specific problem of a man sitting at Darius Blackthorn's right hand, trusted completely, building an empire within the empire with the patient precision of someone who had decided the king was a useful vehicle and nothing more. She thought about Darius in his coronation armor, the resolved face, the iron-gray eyes. She thought, he doesn't know. He made the calculation about me, and that calculation was wrong, and he doesn't know how wrong it was yet. But Carver's operation is bigger than that. Carver was already moving before the coronation. The exile was opportunistic. He used the king's decision to advance an operation that had been running independent of it, which meant Darius Blackthorne was being played by the man he trusted the way Flor was trusted, which meant the king she'd been exiled by was standing on nothing without knowing it. She thought about telling herself that this wasn't her problem, that she'd been thrown away, and the consequences of that belonged entirely to the person who'd thrown her, that the appropriate response to the architecture of her situation was to build here in the north and let the south manage its own disasters. She tried that thought on like a coat and found it didn't fit, not because of the mate bond. That was dimmer now, present but thin, more memory than current, but because of something simpler and colder and more honest. She knew about Carver. She had the information. Letting an empire collapse because its king had wronged her personally was the kind of decision that required a level of smallness she didn't have in her, and she'd tried it in the dark and found it wasn't there. The things she was building in the north, the network, the clans, the structure that was beginning to have actual weight, needed the south not to come apart catastrophically. A destabilized Blackthorne empire meant the northern territories became a contested frontier instead of a separate entity that could negotiate from strength. She had to tell Darius about Carver. The thought sat in her chest like a stone, not because she feared it, because of what it would cost. The specific transaction of reaching back toward the place that had exiled her, not in weakness, not seeking restoration, but as the stronger party delivering a warning. And the price of that was letting Darius Blackthorne know what she'd become in the north, what she was building, what she carried in her blood that was beginning to have a name. It would end the strategic invisibility that was currently her most significant advantage. But Carver was moving on a timeline that didn't care about her advantages. "I need to get a message south," she said. Cade went very still. "To Blackthorne." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment with those flat eyes that saw things he rarely commented on. "You're warning the man who exiled you," he said. "I'm protecting the northern territories from a war they didn't start." She held his gaze. "If Carver succeeds and Blackthorne's war council fractures and the empire moves north on manufactured justification, everything we're building gets crushed before it has weight. I need Darius to deal with Carver before that timeline hits." Cade said, "And if he doesn't?" "Then I'll deal with it myself," she said. "But that's a harder road, and we'll lose time we don't have." He was quiet. "Does he deserve the warning?" Cade said. The question was precise, and she felt its precision. Does he deserve it? She stood at the eastern gap of Ashford with the cold in her blood running its patient current and thought about desert and deserve and the specific irrelevance of both when you were looking at a problem that was bigger than the people inside it. "No," she said, "he doesn't. But you're sending it anyway, because what I'm building doesn't run on what people deserve. It runs on what the situation requires." Cade looked at her for a long beat. Something moved in his expression. That almost reaction that she'd cataloged over 3 weeks. The specific quality of a man who didn't let approval show easily because approval had been used against him too often. "I'll get Finn ready to ride south," he said. She wrote the message herself. Short. No context beyond the courier mark and Carver's name, and 4 lines of operational detail that Darius would need to verify it quickly. No personal content, no reference to the exile or the bond or the Great Hall or anything that lived in the space between who they'd been to each other. At the bottom, instead of her name, she pressed her thumb into the ink and left a print, and she let the cold run through her hand for the 3 seconds it took. And when she lifted her thumb, the print had a faint silvered edge that anyone who had ever been north of the border marker would recognize as something different from an ordinary mark. She folded the parchment, gave it to Finn. Finn rode south. She stood in the yard of Ashford in the clean, cold air after the storm and looked north, where the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of deep winter, establishing itself for a long stay. And she thought about the 2 uncommitted clans and Sarek's finding order and Carver's timeline and the cold in her blood that had a name she was beginning to know. Behind her, she heard Rook's voice. "Frost on the ground this morning," Rook said. "In a perfect circle around the longhouse where you slept." Celine didn't turn. "I know," she said. A pause. "The Coldwater clan has a name for what you're carrying," Rook said. "They have a word for it in their old language." Another pause. "It means the one the winter chose." The cold ran bright in her blood, just for a moment, just long enough to be unmistakable. I don't want to be something the winter chose, Celine said quietly. I know, Rook said. That's probably why it chose you. And that was when Finn came back. Not 2 days later. Not a week. Within 6 hours, which was not enough time to have reached the Southern Empire's border, and was not enough time for anything except turning around at the first waypost, when whatever he'd encountered there was bad enough to require immediate reversal of direction. He came in hard and fast, and his face said everything before his mouth opened. Gret wasn't watching me for Sarek, he said, breathing hard. He was watching me for Carver's people directly. There was a team at the waypost, 3 wolves, Southern Empire marks. They took the message. She felt the cold drop through her from skull to floor. They took it, she said, and they know you're here. Specifically you. They used your name. Celine Frostvale. He looked at her with that recently aged face. Carver knows you're in Ashford. He knows what you've been building, and he knows you sent a message south. She stood in the yard and felt the full shape of the situation settle around her like the walls of a room that had just gotten considerably smaller. Carver would move now, not in 4 months, not in 6 weeks. He'd move now because the variable he couldn't afford was her. Not because of the network she'd built. He'd deal with that. Because of what she knew. Because of the message she'd tried to send. Because a Blackthorn Luna with the specific intelligence she carried was the one thing that could reach Darius before Carver's architecture was complete. He would send something north. He would send it fast, and he would send it with authorization from the War Council that Darius had no reason to question. She had days, maybe less. She looked at Cade. He was already looking at her. The 2 uncommitted clans, she said. I'll go tonight. And the network, every clan that's committed needs to know the timeline has moved. They need to be ready to move as one unit, not 8 separate ones. Everything we've been building toward, it has to happen now instead of later. Cade said, You're not ready. He meant her. The frost. The thing in her blood that was beginning to have a name and a shape and an ancient weight that she was still learning the dimensions of. She looked at him and thought of the woman Rook had mentioned. 30 years ago, came north with a rogue's mark and cold light in her skin, became something the North needed her to be. The cost of it. She thought about what she'd planned to be. Before the coronation, before the Great Hall. The life that had been in front of her and was now definitively behind her. She thought, that person is gone. She walked out of a great hall in a ceremonial dress with stuffed boots, and she walked 4 days north and she doesn't exist anymore. She thought, so who are you now? The cold gave her the answer, bright and absolute and patient and absolutely without mercy and entirely, devastatingly hers. Get the clans, she said. Her voice had changed. She heard it change as it left her mouth. Something in the register, something in the quality of the authority behind it. The specific sound of a person who has stopped becoming and started being. Cade heard it too. She saw it in his face, so that almost reaction, more visible now than she'd ever seen it, the expression of a man who has spent years building something in the dark and has just seen it catch light. He nodded once. He went. She stood alone in the yard of Ashford and let the cold run fully through her for the first time. Not the managed pulse of the last 3 weeks, not the careful controlled current she'd been maintaining, but all of it. The full depth of it. Ancient and absolute and terrifyingly alive. The frost spread from her feet in a slow circle. The air above her hands went silver white. The temperature in the yard dropped 4 degrees in 30 seconds, and every wolf in the settlement felt it, and she heard them go still in their buildings, heard the specific silence of 200 wolves understanding simultaneously that something had changed. She didn't try to push it back. For the first time since the coronation, since the Great Hall, since the moment Darius Blackthorn had looked her in the eyes and made his calculation, she let herself be exactly what she was. And what she was, what had been sleeping in her blood and waking in increments since the border marker, what the cold had been trying to tell her, and the frost on her hands had been demonstrating, and the storm had recognized in a flash of calling to was not the damaged remnant of someone else's decision. It was the first thing this land had produced in 300 years that Carver had not planned for. And somewhere in the south, in the war room of Blackthorn Keep, Haldren Carver was reading the summary of what his people had found at the waypost and was realizing, with the cold precision of a man who planned for everything, that he had made one critical error. He had sent her north, and the north had answered. Carver moves, the Empire marches, and the Ice Queen of the North is no longer hiding what she is. The frost circle around the longhouse was still there at dawn. 3 feet wide, perfect. The individual ice crystals catching the early light in a way that made them look less like weather and more like intention. Wolves who walked past it gave it a wide berth. Not from fear exactly, more the specific animal deference you gave to a thing that had demonstrated it operated outside the normal accounting. Celine was already at the eastern gap when the sun came up, standing in the place where the rock face opened and the valley's defensive logic broke down. Looking east toward the Grey Wolf territory and beyond it the Empire's northern border, and she was thinking about timing. Timing was everything now. The margin between Carver's operation and her counter had been weeks before. Now it was measured in hours and the quality of decisions made under pressure, which was the hardest kind of accounting because pressure compressed both thinking and consequence into the same window. Cade came up beside her at the gap without announcement. He'd been moving through the valley all night, she knew. The 2 uncommitted clans, Ashford's own wolves, the network check-ins that Finn was running from the Stonewater Pack's position on the high ridge. Both clans, he said. She looked at him. Both committed. Midnight. He paused. Drev talked to them. Didn't even need me to close it. He laid out the timeline and they made their call. 8 clans. All 8. She felt this settle in her chest. Not triumph, not yet. Something more structural than that. The specific solidity of a foundation that has just received its last load-bearing piece. How long before Carver's team reaches the border marker? She said. Finn's scout on the South Road reports a military column left the last Empire waypost yesterday at midday. 40 wolves. Blackthorn military insignia, War Council authorization. His voice was careful and flat. Fast march. They'll hit the border marker by midday today. Celine calculated. The border marker to Ashford was 12 hours on foot, 7 at wolf pace. The column would shift for speed and it wouldn't stop. 7 hours, she said, give or take. She looked at the eastern gap. 40 Blackthorn military wolves authorized by a War Council directive that Darius had no reason to question. Coming to extract a named exile who had, from the Empire's official perspective, violated the terms of her northern exile by conducting intelligence operations against Blackthorn interests. The authorization Carver would have written was clean, technically correct. Darius would have signed it without a second look because it described a security operation, not what it actually was. She had 7 hours to position 8 clans, secure the valley's 3 approach routes, and stand in the path of a legitimate military column with nothing except the truth and what lived in her blood. She turned from the gap and started walking. The next 4 hours were the most purely focused she'd ever operated in. The part of her that had run border intelligence for 2 years came fully online, not the careful, always deferring version she'd run inside the War Council's structure, but the complete version, the one that had never had full operational control before, and moved through the problem now like something released. She split the 8 clans into 3 groups. Drev's Coldwater Wolves and the Stonewater Pack took the high ridge positions. Not combat positions, not yet, just presence. The specific strategic message of wolves on high ground that said we know you're coming and we knew it before you got here. Sola's Northeastern Clan and the West Haven group covered the valley's 2 secondary approaches, the routes Carver's intelligence would have logged as potential Ashford flanking options. The remaining 4 clans pulled into Ashford itself, consolidated, visible. She told each group leader the same thing. You hold your position until I say otherwise. Nobody moves first. Nobody engages without my call. The objective is not to fight 40 Blackthorn wolves. The objective is to make 40 Blackthorn wolves understand what they're actually standing in front of before anyone makes a decision that can't be unmade. Bram looked at her when she gave the briefing and said, "And if they don't stop, then we make it expensive enough that stopping becomes the rational choice. And if the cost of making it expensive is, Bram," she held his gaze, "I know what I'm asking everyone to risk. I'm not pretending otherwise." He nodded, and it was the same kind of nod Cade gave, the one that closed a door and opened a different one. She went back to Ashford and found the space behind the main longhouse where she'd been going at night when the cold needed somewhere to go that wasn't the inside of a building full of sleeping wolves. She stood there in the dirt and let it run, not the managed pulse, not the controlled current. She let the full depth of it move through her, and she tracked it methodically, the way she'd tracked the perimeter on her first day. Not trying to stop it or direct it, just mapping it, understanding its dimensions. It was larger than she'd thought 3 weeks ago. It had been larger all along. She'd been managing it small because small was safe, small was invisible, small was the operational requirement of a person who needed to survive long enough to understand what she was carrying. But Carver's column was 7 hours out, and invisibility was no longer an available strategy. The frost spread from her in a slow radius, 12 feet, then 15. The air above her hands went silver white, and this time she let it build, let it get as bright as it wanted to, and found that the limit was not where she'd thought it was. It was considerably further out. She thought about the first Lunar Queen, the stories she'd dismissed as northern myth, the bloodline scattered into the frozen territories centuries ago. She thought, if this is inheritance, then whoever left it intended it to be used. You don't carry a weapon for 300 years just to keep it sheathed. She let the frost recede, measured the effort, minimal. That was the information she needed. It wasn't costing her the way it cost her 3 weeks ago. The body had been adapting, the way Rook had said, the way everything in the north adapted or didn't survive. She went to find Cade. He was in the council house doing what he did when he was thinking, hands working, this time sharpening a blade with methodical patience, his wolf close to the surface, that old and large energy filling the room. I need you to know something, she said. He looked up. When the column arrives, I'm going to meet them at the valley approach. Alone. The blade stopped moving. No. Not negotiable. Celine, if I walk out there with 8 clans at my back, it reads as military confrontation. That gives Carver's team justification for force, and it escalates before I have the chance to make the actual case. She held his gaze. If I walk out alone, it's a conversation, and I'm very good at conversations. It's 40 trained military wolves. I know what it is. He set the blade down. And if the conversation goes wrong, then the 8 clans on the ridges and at the approaches become extremely relevant. She paused. I'm not walking out there to die, Cade. I'm walking out there because the person who needs to hear what I have to say is the field commander, and field commanders respond differently when there's no crowd to perform for. He looked at her for a long time with that measuring flatness. You've been planning this since this morning, he said. Since last night, she admitted. And the other thing, he nodded slightly toward her hands, toward the space where the frost had been visible for 3 weeks to anyone paying attention. You're going to use it. If I need to. You don't know the full shape of it yet? No, she said. But I know enough. A pause. It chose this situation as much as it chose me. That has to count for something. Cade was quiet. I'll be on the ridge, he said finally. Personal. Not as a clan position. I know you will. She smiled at him. Small, real, the first one she'd produced in this valley that wasn't performance. And she saw him register it with that almost reaction. She went to prepare. The Blackthorn military column hit the valley approach at 3 hours past midday, which meant they'd pushed harder than a standard fast march. Someone had communicated urgency. Celine was already standing at the valley's natural entrance point, a rocky narrowing where the approach road threaded between 2 hillsides. When the column's forward scouts crested the last rise and stopped, she counted the pause. 3 seconds. 4. Long enough for the scouts to assess what they were looking at, which was a single woman in a heavy northern cloak standing in the road with no weapons drawn and no visible backup and an absolute stillness that said she had been waiting for them. The column came to the narrowing and stopped. The field commander was a man she recognized, Bren Vassell, senior Blackthorn military officer, one of the 3 people on the War Council who she'd assessed as genuinely competent rather than politically elevated. Late 40s. A soldier's body gone winter hard. He looked at her from horseback with the specific expression of a man who has been given a straightforward operational assignment and has just encountered something that doesn't fit the operational template. Celine Frostvale, he said. His voice was neutral, professional. Commander Vassell. He hadn't expected her to know his name. She saw it in the fractional adjustment of his posture. You're aware of the War Council directive, he said. I'm aware of what it says on the surface, she said. I need 30 minutes to tell you what it actually is before you decide whether to follow it. That's not how directives work. No, she agreed. But you're a competent officer who's been at that table long enough to know the difference between a security operation and an elimination order dressed in security language. She held his gaze. This directive came from Haldren Carver, 12 hours after a courier package was intercepted on the Northern Road. I need 30 minutes and I need to show you the courier mark. Vassal looked at her for a long moment. Around him, 40 wolves were watching with the specific attention of trained soldiers who were also watching their commander, because the quality of his decision in the next 60 seconds would tell them everything about what kind of situation they were actually in. 30 minutes, Vassal said. She talked for 28. She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for Drev, for Sola, for every clan leader in the valley. Clean sequence, verifiable evidence, the courier mark, the timeline, Finn's testimony, the Grey Wolf operation, the 14 months of patient architecture. She added what she hadn't told the clans yet: the specific mechanism by which Carver had positioned the War Council directive, the language he'd used that would pass Darius his review without triggering his scrutiny, and the end state of the operation if it completed successfully, which included the Northern Campaign, yes, but also the systematic hollowing of the War Council's independent function, the gradual transfer of strategic authority to a network of Carver's controlled assets, the specific long game of a man who had decided, at some point in the last several years, that the king was more useful as a figure than as a ruler. Vassal listened the way experienced military officers listened, completely, without expression, absorbing and filing. When she finished, he sat on his horse in the cold air and looked at the courier mark rubbing for a long time. "This is verifiable," he said. It wasn't a question. "Independently, Finn can give you the relay chain. The package itself will be in Carver's courier network. If you pull the Northern Route's physical record before he can purge it, you'll have the documentation." Vassal looked at her. "You understand that if this is accurate, I know what it means. It means the War Council has been compromised at its most senior level. It means every major strategic decision in the last 14 months needs to be reviewed." His voice was very flat. "It means the king has been operating on corrupted intelligence." "Yes. And you're telling me this," he said slowly. "You, who he exiled publicly, who Carver used as an operational pawn." She held his gaze. "Because it's true, and you need to know it. Those are the only two reasons that matter right now." Vassal was quiet for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "He's been asking about you." The cold in her blood went absolutely still. "Who has?" "The king." Vassal looked at her steadily. "Twice in the last 2 weeks. Not officially. He didn't route it through council channels. Directly to me, asking whether Northern Route reports had mentioned any activity consistent with," he paused, "with someone who knew how to move through territory cleanly." She processed this with the specific compartmentalization of a person who has learned that certain information needs to be handled later, in a different context, not here with 40 soldiers watching her face. "That's not relevant to the current situation," she said. "No," Vassal said, "but it's relevant to what I do next." He looked at the courier mark one more time. Then he looked up at the ridges. She saw him clock the Coldwater wolves on the high ground, saw the professional assessment move across his face, positions, numbers, the tactical geometry of a valley approach with elevation coverage on both sides. "How many?" he said. 8 clans, combined." His jaw tightened. "You built this in 3 weeks." "I built it in 3 weeks because the situation required it." She paused. "Commander, I'm not your enemy. I'm not the North's enemy. I'm the only person standing between Carver's operation and a war that kills people on both sides for his benefit." She kept her voice level. "The directive you're carrying is designed to eliminate the one intelligence asset who can bring him down before he completes the architecture. I need you to make a choice about which side of that you want to be on." The silence stretched. 40 wolves, very still. The ridges very still. The cold air running between all of them, carrying the specific electric quality of a situation balanced on its own edge. Vassal said, "I need to reach the king directly, not through council channels. I know a courier route that bypasses the standard chain." His eyes sharpened. "Of course you do." "It's what I do," she said. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, nothing as loose as that, but the professional acknowledgement of one person who is very good at a specific kind of work, recognizing the same quality in another. "I'm standing down the column," he said, "pending direct royal consultation." He raised his voice slightly, the command register that carried without effort. "Stand down, hold position." The column went to rest. Vassal dismounted and came to stand in front of her at eye level, which required looking up a few inches, which she noted he did without adjusting his posture to compensate. "If you've read this wrong," he said quietly. "I haven't." "If you have, if this is what it looks like on the surface, an exile who's built a northern militia and is running a disinformation operation against the senior war council." "I know what it looks like," she said. "I also know what it is. You can spend a week verifying independently before you decide." A pause. "But Carver will know the column stood down within 24 hours. Whatever you're going to do, you have that window." He held her gaze for a long moment, with the eyes of a man who had spent his career developing the ability to assess people quickly and accurately and was running that assessment now at full power. "Message to the king," he said. "Your route, tonight." "Done." He turned back to his column. She stood at the valley approach and watched 40 Blackthorn military wolves set camp in the flat ground below the narrowing, and felt the 8 clans on the ridges and at the approaches exhale in a collective wave that she felt in her sternum. Not victory? Not yet. Not even close to yet. But a door she'd needed to stay open was still open. She went back to Ashford. Cade came down off the ridge 2 hours later. He came into the council house where she was sitting with Rook and Finn and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with those flat eyes. "You talked 40 wolves into standing down," he said. "I talked one commander into making a phone call to his king," she said. "It's different." Most people would call it the same thing. Most people haven't run a war council intelligence operation. She looked at the table. "He's going to verify what I told him, independently. If Carver's courier network documentation is still intact, Vassal will have what he needs within 24 hours. And if Carver purges it first," she looked up, "then we go a different way." Finn said, "Sarek is going to know the column stood down. His border scouts will have reported it by now." "I know. He's going to move." "I know that too." She looked at the map she'd been working on for 3 weeks. The valley, the approaches, the 8 clan positions. The route network that Finn had built into something that could carry information from the northeastern ridge to the southern border marker in 6 hours on a clear day. Then she looked at the eastern gap. Sarek had 60 wolves. She had 8 clans totaling, by last count, approximately 230 wolves of varying battle readiness. The numbers looked favorable until you factored in that Grey Wolf was a military clan that had been in active territorial conflict for 3 years, and her 8 clans were rogue settlements who had been surviving, not fighting. There was a difference. She respected the difference, but she'd also spent 3 weeks watching these wolves work, and what she'd seen was something she'd been trying to name and had finally found the word for. Hunger. Not desperation, that was a different thing, the kind that made people sloppy and reactive. This was older and colder than desperation. This was the hunger of people who had been told, by exile and loss and the Empire's systematic discarding, that they were not worth defending, who had built something anyway out of stubbornness and necessity, who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to show up and say, "What you built matters. What you are matters. Here's the shape of what we're fighting for." That kind of hunger didn't make you reckless. It made you exactly as dangerous as you needed to be. The attack came at 2 in the morning. Not Sarek directly. Not the full Grey Wolf force. A probe. 20 wolves hitting the northeastern approach in the dark, fast and quiet. The specific technique of a commander testing the defense's response time and alert structure before committing to a full push. Sola's clan was ready. Celine heard it from Ashford, the specific sounds of a night engagement carried by cold air, short and sharp, and over quickly. She was on her feet before the sounds finished. Cade was already at the door. "Probe," he said. "I heard." "Sola? She'll hold it. It's what she does." Celine was pulling on her gear, the heavy northern cloak and the knife at her belt, and the additional blade Cade had pressed into her hands 4 days ago, without comment, which she'd accepted without comment because it was that kind of conversation. He's not committing the full force yet. He's reading us. He'll read that we're ready. He'll read that the northeastern approach has coverage. That changes his geometry. Cade looked at her in the dark. You know where he comes next. The Eastern Gap, she said. It's the only approach where he knows we have a structural vulnerability. His border scouts will have mapped it. That's what you've been setting up. Since day one, she said. She'd said to Cade 3 weeks ago that the gap was not just a vulnerability, but an option. She'd been building toward this since the perimeter walk, not hoping for the attack, but preparing for the reality that preparation alone was never enough. And at some point, the preparation became the fight itself. The Eastern Gap had a vulnerability. She'd made sure Sarek's scouts could verify that vulnerability. She'd also made sure that the thing waiting inside the vulnerability was not what his map said it was. She and Cade moved to the gap in the dark with 12 wolves, not Ashford's full force, specifically not that. The 12 she'd selected in the last week for a specific combination of qualities: speed, nerve, and the ability to hold a position under pressure without needing constant instruction. People who'd been doing hard things alone for long enough that they didn't require hand-holding to stay functional. She positioned them in the rock face above the gap. Not in it, above it, using the same elevation logic that Drev's cold water wolves had been running on the high ridge. Then she walked into the gap herself and stood at its center and waited. This was the part Cade hadn't liked. She'd explained it twice and he'd argued it twice and then gone quiet with the specific silence of a man who understood the logic and hated it simultaneously, which was a response she'd respected because it was honest. The logic was simple. Sarek's scouts had reported the gap as a vulnerability, but they'd also reported her as the target. If there was any chance of getting Sarek to stop, really stop, not just pull back and come harder the next time, it required her to be visible, to be the thing he was reaching for, standing where he expected to find it, which was the oldest trap in the world and worked with alarming consistency on people whose momentum made them bad at recalculating. She stood in the gap in the dark with the cold in her blood and waited. They came at the 4th hour, 40 wolves through the eastern approach, moving fast and quiet. Sarek himself at the front. She could tell by the quality of the energy, the specific alpha pressure wave that large, old, confident wolves generated when they moved at speed with intent. She'd felt that energy before, in Darius, in the War Council chamber, in the border operations where she'd worked alongside wolves who were genuinely dangerous. She stood still. Let them come. The forward wolves hit the gap entrance and slowed, registering her, registering the stillness of her, the single figure standing in the narrowing without weapons drawn, which was wrong enough that it triggered the same pause Vassal's scouts had triggered at the valley approach. 3 seconds. Sarek came through the forward line. He was large, not as large as she'd built him in her assessment, but large enough with a wolf that ran even closer to the surface than Cade's. The specific, barely contained quality of an alpha who'd been in active territory conflict long enough that the human and the animal had started to blur their management boundaries. He looked at her with eyes that were already partly wolf, and she felt his alpha pressure hit her like a physical force. Her wolf came up. Not submissively. The specific response she'd been feeling build for 3 weeks. The answering pressure of something that was not interested in submission and never had been and was finished pretending. Frostvale, Sarek said. His voice was rough, direct. She respected direct. Step aside. We need to have a conversation first, she said. I don't negotiate with exiles. You negotiate with Carver. That makes his exiles the most dangerous people you'll talk to today. She held his gaze. He set you up. 14 months ago, he made contact and he's been managing you toward a campaign that ends with Blackthorn absorbing Grey Wolf territory alongside everything else north of the border marker. You don't get a banner. You get eliminated once you've done the destabilization work. Sarek's jaw tightened. I've got 40 wolves behind me, he said, and I've got a problem with your intel that's going to kill some of them unnecessarily. She kept her voice level. Sarek, I have the courier mark. I have the timeline. I have a Blackthorn military commander who stood down a 40-wolf column this afternoon because he's verifying the same information. This operation is collapsing around Carver right now. The question is whether you're going to be the instrument of it or whether you walk away clean. He looked at her, looked at the gap, looked at the rock faces above it. She watched him do the calculation. watched his eyes move with professional precision across the elevated positions, the specific absence of defensive wolves in the gap itself, the single figure standing where the scouts had said the vulnerability was. "You've got wolves up there," he said. "Yes." "You let us come through the gap." "Yes." "Because you wanted the conversation. Because I wanted you to understand what you're actually standing in before you commit 40 wolves to Carver's timeline." The silence in the gap was total. Behind Sarek, 40 wolves held very still with the specific attention of soldiers who were reading their alpha the way soldiers always read their commander. Not for orders yet, for the quality of his thinking, for whether the situation had changed in ways the briefing hadn't covered. "You're not what I was told you were," Sarek said. "I know. They said damaged goods, easy extraction. They were wrong about what 3 weeks in the north does to someone who was already built for it." She paused. "I'm giving you a way out of Carver's operation before it burns. Take it." He looked at her for a long time. His wolf was doing something complicated. She could feel it, the specific pressure of an alpha whose dominance instinct was running against his strategic assessment, the collision of a body that wanted to push forward and a mind that was reading the room accurately. What happened next, she hadn't planned for. The sound came from the south, carried on the night air, long, deep, the specific resonance of a wolf's call that wasn't combat, wasn't alarm, was something older and more formal. A summons. She recognized the call protocol from her war council days. The emergency direct contact signal used when a senior officer needed to bypass all chain of command structure and deliver a message to a specific person. Vassal. She looked south toward Ashford, where the call had originated. Sarek looked south too. "Your commander," he said. "Yes." Her voice was steady. Inside, the cold in her blood was running with the specific bright intensity that she was learning to read as signal rather than sensation, the equivalent of a body's alert system registering something important. "He verified your information," Sarek said. "It wasn't a question." "That would be my read." Sarek looked at her. He looked at the rock faces. He looked at his 40 wolves. He said, "Stand down." She breathed through it, kept her face level. She walked south toward Ashford, and Vassal met her at the settlement entrance, his face carrying the specific compressed quality of a military professional who has just processed information that required a fundamental reconfiguration of everything he thought he knew about the situation he was operating in. "I pulled the Northern Route documentation," Vassal said. He was keeping his voice low, which told her everything she needed to know about what he'd found. "Before Carver could. I still have contacts in the courier network that predate his influence." He looked at her. "It's everything you said it was." "I know. More than you said. He's been running 3 separate asset networks through the Northern Territories. Grey Wolf was one. There are 2 others." He paused. "One of them has access to the War Council's internal documentation." She felt the cold go absolutely flat. "The internal documentation," she said. "Troop movements, supply chains, the border assessment reports from the last 8 months. His jaw was tight. "He's been feeding strategic intelligence to—" He stopped. "We don't know who the end recipient is yet." She stood with this. Carver wasn't just destabilizing the North. He was running intelligence for someone else. Someone with the resources to maintain 3 separate Northern asset networks through a senior War Council member. Someone who wanted Blackthorn's strategic information badly enough to run a 14-month operation to get it. Enemy kingdoms. She thought of the story outline she'd been carrying in the back of her mind. The escalating picture of an empire being hollowed from inside, the patient architecture of a man who had decided the king was a vehicle, and she extended it forward and saw where it was going. When the war came, not Carver's manufactured Northern campaign, but the real one, the enemy kingdoms that had been watching for weakness, that had been getting Blackthorn's strategic assessments forwarded to them for 8 months. They wouldn't be guessing at the Empire's vulnerabilities. They'd know exactly where every load-bearing wall was. And Darius didn't know. She looked at Vassal. "You need to get south, tonight. Not through standard channels. Everything Carver has access to has to be considered compromised." She paused. "Take the courier route Finn will give you. Get to the king before Carver knows the documentation was pulled." And you? Vassal said. She looked at the 8 clans spread through the valley around her, at the 40 military wolves camped at the approach, at Sarek's contingent standing in uncertain truce at the Eastern Gap, at the specific architecture of something she'd built in 3 weeks from nothing except information and the cold in her blood and the particular hunger of people who'd been waiting for something worth fighting for. I'm staying north, she said. This is where I need to be. Vassal looked at her. Something in his face, the same quality she'd seen in Cade's face, in Drev's, in Sola's, the specific expression of a person who has been in the vicinity of a thing that is larger than they expected and is adjusting their understanding of the landscape accordingly. The king, Vassal said carefully. When I tell him what I've found, what I tell him about you, what you've built here, tell him the truth, she said, all of it. He'll come north. I know. You understand what that means. She looked at him steadily. Yes. He nodded once. He went to find Finn for the courier route. She stood in the entrance of Ashford in the early morning dark and felt the full weight of what the next days held. Vassal riding south with documentation that would detonate Carver's operation from the inside. Sarek standing down in the east, the enemy kingdom's war already in motion on a timeline she couldn't control, and Darius Blackthorne riding north toward a queen he thought he'd discarded. The cold in her blood ran its bright, patient current. She thought about the woman she'd been at the coronation, the ceremonial dress and the stuffed boots, and the 60 seconds she'd given herself at the border marker to feel the full weight of the end of everything she'd planned on being. She thought, that woman is gone. She thought, and the one who replaced her is something the Empire has never dealt with before. She thought, ready or not. Behind her, Cade's voice came from the dark. Vassal just rode out. I know. Sarek's wolves are still standing down. For now. A pause. You know what happens when the king gets that message? Yes. Another pause. Longer. Are you ready for that? She looked north, where the sky was beginning to make up its mind about dawn, the horizon going from absolute black to something darker than dark that was still somehow different, the specific quality of a night that has decided it's almost finished with itself. She was not ready. She was also not the person who got to be unready, which was its own kind of answer. Cade, she said. Yeah. Get the clans together, all 8, full council. She paused. It's time they knew the whole shape of what we are. He didn't ask what she meant. He'd been watching her for 3 weeks. He knew. She heard him move away behind her toward the settlement, toward the 8 clans that were about to learn they weren't a survival coalition anymore. The dawn was coming. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. He'd anticipated this, she could see that. More like confirmation of a thing he'd been tracking and hadn't been certain of. The Northern Territories need the queen they have, she said. Not a Luna at a southern throne. I know, he said quietly. Then why were you going to ask? He looked at her for a long moment with those iron-gray eyes, and she saw in them something she'd seen only rarely in the 2 years they'd occupied the same orbit. The specific, undefended quality of a man who had stopped performing and was simply present, simply himself, in all the ways that self was damaged and difficult and genuinely trying to be honest. Because I owed you the asking, he said, not because I expected the answer to be yes. She held his gaze. She thought about the mate bond, thin and present like a healed scar. She thought about what Rook had said, that the cost was everything she'd planned on being instead. She thought about the fact that she was standing on that cost right now and it was solid under her feet, and that the woman who would have said yes to the throne offer was not less than who she was now, just earlier, just the first version, just the draft. The bond, she said. Yes. It's not what it was. No, he said. I know that. But it's there. Yes. A pause. I don't expect you to. I'm not asking you to. He stopped. Which was interesting, because Darius Blackthorne had never been a man who didn't know how to finish a sentence. I don't know what I'm asking, he said. I'm telling you it's there. What you do with that is yours. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it would mean to carry the bond while ruling the North, whether the thread between them would be a complication or simply a fact, the way a scar was a fact. She thought about the difference between a wound and a history. about the specific emotional intelligence required to hold both things simultaneously, what he had done to her and what he was now, and the fact that neither canceled the other. She thought, this is what it actually looks like. Not the easy version where he's just wrong or just right. The real version where a person is capable of tremendous failure and genuine reckoning simultaneously, and you have to decide what to do with that without the comfort of a clean answer. She said, "Don't come north unless I ask you to." He nodded. "Don't send war council delegations without going through the Northern Council first." "Yes." "And Darius?" She waited until his eyes met hers fully. "If you ever again make a decision about this territory, about these people, about me using the calculus you used at the coronation, I will end the alliance and I will fight the Eastern campaign from the northern side, and I will let you figure out what that costs you." He held her gaze. "I understand," he said. She believed him, not because she was certain he'd never fail again. She had enough experience with human beings to know that understanding and not repeating were not the same guarantee, but because of the quality of how he said it, not the placating agreement of a man trying to get what he came for, but the specific gravity of someone who has looked clearly at the thing they did and is living inside that look. That was enough. Not everything. Enough. She turned toward Ashford. She stopped. She turned back, because there was one more thing, and she was not in the habit anymore of leaving things unsaid in the name of appearances. "I know you were asking Vassal about me," she said. He went very still. "I know you were tracking whether anyone matching my movement pattern was active in the Northern Territories." She held his gaze. "What I want to know is why." He was quiet for a long moment. The 6 wolves at the rise were at enough distance that this conversation existed entirely between the two of them, which was the only version of it that would have worked. "Because I made a mistake," he said slowly, "and I didn't understand the full scale of it until it was gone, and by the time I understood it, the official channels for doing anything about it had been sealed by my own decision." He paused. "So I did the unofficial version. I asked someone I trusted to tell me if—" He stopped. "I needed to know you were alive." She stood with this. It did not fix anything. It did not revise the Great Hall or the exile or the 4 days walking north in stuffed boots or the 60 seconds at the border marker. It did not change what 3 months in the north had cost or built or permanently altered in the architecture of who she was. But it was true. She could hear the truth in it, the specific sound of a thing that had not been composed for effect, but simply stated because it was real. "I was alive," she said. "I know that now." She turned back toward Ashford and walked up the slope, and she did not look back, not because it would have been too hard, but because the direction she was moving in was the one that mattered, and she had learned in blood and frost and 3 months of the hardest work of her life that you kept your eyes on where you were going, not where you'd been. Cade met her at the settlement entrance. He looked at her, looked at Darius's small party at the rise, looked back at her. "Well?" he said. "Sovereign territory," she said. "Permanent. Northern Council with full authority. Trade route rights in the post-war settlement. Eastern Defense Corridor access in exchange." He was quiet for a moment. "That's everything," he said. "Yes." He agreed to all of it. "Yes." Cade looked at her with those measuring eyes that had been calibrating her since her first day in the valley. "And the personal question," he said. She looked at him. She had never been able to get much past Cade, which she suspected was one of the reasons she'd trusted him as quickly as she had. People who saw clearly were the only ones worth standing next to in any situation that required accurate information. "The bond is still there," she said. "Thin, changed, not gone." She paused. "I'm not going south. He's not staying north. The rest of it is what it is. Something I'll carry that doesn't control me." She met his gaze. "Does that answer the question?" "Close enough," he said. She almost smiled. "Didn't, quite, but close." "The Eastern campaign," she said. "We need to start planning for the possibility that the front comes closer than the border. If the enemy kingdoms are moving with Blackthorn's strategic intelligence, they'll know the corridor value. They might push north." "Then we plan for north," he said. Simply. As if this were obvious. "And the post-war council," she said. "When this is done, there's going to be a moment where the entire settlement structure of the northern and eastern territories gets renegotiated. That moment needs the northern clans at the table with a position and a voice and someone who knows how the Southern Empire's political architecture actually works. He looked at her steadily. Someone like the former Luna of Blackthorn Keep, who spent 2 years inside the War Council's intelligence operation. Exactly like that. He nodded. She looked out at Ashford, the settlement that had been her exile ground and had become her foundation, the wolves moving through their mourning with the specific purposeful efficiency of a community that had gone to sleep 3 months ago as a collection of survival strategies and was waking up as something with a name and a direction. The frost circle was still faintly visible in the shadow of the longhouse wall. The supply lines Finn ran were already operational, 8 clans networked in a web of information flow that she could feel the shape of the way you felt, the shape of something you'd built with your own hands. She thought about what Rook had said about the woman 30 years ago. Cost her everything she'd planned on being instead. She thought, yes, it did. She thought, and what it gave her was everything she'd never planned on being, which turned out to be larger. That was the thing nobody told you about being rebuilt by circumstance. The plans you'd made for yourself were built to the scale of who you were when you made them. The version of you that came through the fire, or the frost in her case, was built to a different scale entirely, and the plans that would have once felt like enough now fit the way ceremonial boots fit when you needed to walk 4 days north. They didn't. So you made new ones. Rook came out of the council house and stood beside her, looking south toward the rise where Darius's party was still waiting. He'll leave soon, Celine said. I know. A pause. How'd it go? The way it needed to. Rook looked at her with those old ice eyes. The woman 30 years ago, Celine said. The one who came north with cold light in her skin. What happened to her in the end? Rook was quiet for a moment. She built something that outlasted everyone who tried to tell her she couldn't, Rook said. And she died old, which in the north is the only ending worth having. Celine held that. Did she find peace? She said. Rook considered. She found something better, she said. She found a purpose big enough that peace became a secondary question. Celine looked north, where the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of a northern winter that had made up its mind and intended to stay. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the 8 clans were moving through their days. Drev's Coldwater Wolves, Sola's Northeastern Force, the Stonewater Pack on the high ridges, the West Haven Group. All of them connected by a network that Finn was expanding daily, by the specific shared understanding of people who had stopped being exiles and started being a nation. She felt the cold in her blood run its patient current. She felt the bond in her chest, thin and changed and real. She felt the weight of the Eastern campaign ahead, and the post-war negotiations, and the long, slow work of building a thing that could last longer than the crisis that had made it necessary. She felt all of it without flinching from any of it. Because this was what was left when you'd survived the thing that was supposed to finish you. Not peace, not yet, not simply. Something more honest than peace. The specific solidity of a person who has been taken to the edge of what they could endure and has come back knowing something they didn't know before. That the edge is further than they thought. That the thing in them that refused to die is not luck or specialness, but the oldest and most fundamental stubbornness of a life that has decided it is not finished. That was worth more than peace. That was worth everything it had cost. She heard Darius's party begin to move south, and she did not watch them go, and she was not pretending. The direction she faced was north, and north was where everything that mattered was waiting for her. And she was, at last and entirely and without apology, exactly where she was supposed to be. The frost around her feet was perfectly still. The silver crown of the north was not a physical object. No one had placed it on her head. There had been no ceremony, no great hall, no crimson runner or ceremonial dress or 1,000 witnesses. There was just a woman standing in the clean, cold air of the northern territories, on the foundation she had built from exile and fury and frost, and the ancient sleeping power of a bloodline that had chosen its vessel carefully and waited 300 years for exactly the right broken thing to rebuild itself into something unbreakable. And that was enough. That was everything. The north held its breath. Then the wind moved, and the day began, and she went to work.